Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Becomes an Analyst Villain? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. I cannot simply say you can become a hero even without power. All Might's words rang in Izuku's head long after he'd left the roof. He'd gone straight home, muttering a greeting to his mother as he walked like a dead man to his room and locked himself in. I cannot simply say you can become a hero even without power. I can't become a hero without power, Izuku translated as he stood in the center of his room, staring at the texture of his ceiling. A moment ago, he'd gone on a rampage around his room, pulling down all the All Might merch. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away, so he'd stacked it in piles outside his room, informing his mother that it all could be brought to donation. She'd looked extremely concerned, but one look at his puffy eyes and angry forehead made her just nod in acceptance and let him be. His room was empty and bare now, almost completely devoid of color. But All Might, the thought of All Might now made Izuku's hands shake with anger and disappointment. All Might was supposed to be a hero. It was practically his job to make people feel better about their problems, and instead All Might's words had made Kaken's suggestion to swan dive off a roof feel like an extremely viable option for Izuku. And then right afterwards, Izuku had jumped in to save Kaken from that slime villain, and the heroes had told him off. They told him that his actions were a dangerous and unnecessary risk, that they'd had the situation handled, but anyone who took one look at the scene would have known that that situation was far from handled. And then when they'd found out he was quirkless, the world is too dangerous for you. Stop playing hero. You're weak. Useless. Izuku shook his head, eyes welling up with tears, and jammed the heels of his hands into his eye sockets. I knew this was coming, he reminded himself. I knew I couldn't be a hero. I knew that this was the only answer. So then why does it hurt so badly? He felt his legs go weak underneath him and he crumpled to the ground, chest tightening as he sobbed into his fists. I cannot simply say you can become a hero even without power. I don't care what you can and can't say, Izuku sobbed into his hands. I don't care. It took him a few minutes to calm down again, but when he'd succeeded he stood up, resolve strengthening once more. I can be a hero, he said firmly, clenching his fists by his side. That was a blow, but I can still do it. I don't care what anyone says, I'll do it anyway. His words had an air of emptiness to them now, but he was determined. Later that night, Izuku was sitting at his computer, looking into possible options for where he could go to become somebody other than a useless, quirkless nobody. His first thought, of course, one that had crossed his mind many times in the past, was the possibility of getting a quirk from someone. Once in an online forum, he'd come across a rumor that there was a man who could take and give quirks as he pleased. The idea had obviously seemed wonderful to Izuku, who had then spent several nights breaking many laws to hack into some very high-security information vaults. His hacking skills weren't the best in the world, mostly because it was against the law, and as a hero it was going to be his job to preserve the law, but occasionally he'd have a little lapse into curiosity and unearth his hacking knowledge again in order to get some piece of information or other. The point of all this being that Izuku wasn't the best hacker, and was, in fact, pretty rusty. It took him a while, but eventually he found confirmation that the man did, in fact, exist. However, having this information was pretty much pointless, because all the leads as to where the man might actually be were dead ends. So that was out. His second thought was just to train really hard by himself and hopefully pass the entrance exam by a combination of luck and, no, just luck. That idea fell through quickly. After that, Izuku had started going through lists of pro heroes who had quirks that weren't exactly heroic. People like the underground hero Eraserhead, whose quirk couldn't be used for offense, and who had to rely on actual physical skill to get anything done. After a while, he realized that even if he could find a hero like that close enough to train him, the chances of him actually being able to convince that hero to train him were extremely low, next to zero. He was quirkless, after all, and none of the pro heroes he'd met seemed to believe that a quirkless boy could ever be a true hero. All that led Izuku to where he was currently, researching the hero killer, Stain. He'd already dug in pretty deep, and was once again utilizing his rusty hacking skills to look into some security cameras near where Stain's last sighting was. The hero killer was mobile enough to be able to train Izuku near his home, and he had some amazing technical expertise, even without use of his quirk. He also probably would be easier than a pro hero to convince, which was kind of disgusting the more Izuku thought about it. After a long night of searching, a night that could have been much shorter if he hadn't forgotten a few hacking essentials, Izuku was able to create a list of a few viable options for where Stain could be hiding out. He filled a backpack with his hero research, waited for his mom to fall asleep, and then snuck out, dropping quietly into the night. By the fourth location on his list, Izuku was starting to give up hope. The night was nearing its end, he hadn't found Stain, and he still had school tomorrow. He sighed and knocked on the door. If this wasn't it, he'd have to start all over again tomorrow, and that was going to really suck. To his immense surprise, the door opened a crack and one suspicious-looking eye peered out. Hello," Izuku said, bowing a little. "I'm looking for, He glanced nervously down the hallway, worried about being heard. "Someone," he finished vaguely. "They're not here," the person said, starting to close the door again. "Oh, it's you," he exclaimed, eyes brightening up as he recognized the villains or maybe vigilantes, as he wasn't sure exactly what he thought of Stain yet voice from some unprofessional footage he'd found online. "I was wondering if you could train me, please?" The door froze and then opened even wider than it had been before, revealing Stain's entire left side, a lot of which was covered in blood. Izuku took a step back, forcing himself to remember that he'd been expecting this. He'd need to put his morals aside for just a little bit while he got stronger and learned to fight. "You want me to train you?" Stain said, in a tone of immense disbelief. He nodded weakly. "Well, I was originally going to go to a pro hero," he began explaining in a low mutter, "but then I realized that none of them probably had time, and I don't really have any leverage or way to convince them that I'm worth training, especially since I don't have a quirk, and so I was looking for other ways for me to learn and your name came up, and while I'm not really all that excited about your whole killing rampage, I still thought I'd—" "Kid," Stain interrupted. "Slow down, I have some questions." "Why, sir? Are you with the police?" he asked bluntly, hoping to put everything out in the open right away. Izuku shook his head. "No, they'd have to be pretty desperate to send in a 15-year-old to catch ya." "Here's a free lesson for you," the hero killer said, interrupting him again. "When someone you don't know you can trust asks you a question, answer it in as few words as possible. When you ramble, you reveal too much information about yourself. Got it?" Izuku nodded, already making a mental note to put in his notebook later. "Now did you say you're quirkless?" "Yes." Izuku cut himself off before he started to ramble. Stain smirked a little at his attempts to keep his replies short. "And you found me all by yourself?" Izuku nodded, lips pursed together. "And why do you want training?" "I want to be a hero," he said with conviction. "But everyone told me I can't because I don't have a quirk." He opened his mouth to say more, but then, remembering Stain's lesson a moment ago, closed it again. "Why do you want to be a hero?" Stain asked, folding his arms. Izuku could sense that one misstep here and it was all over. Izuku's eyebrows furrowed together and he set his jaw in determination. "I want to be a hero who saves people with a smile. One who runs in and helps people no matter the danger they're in. I want people to feel safe when they see me and know everything will be fine because I'm there." Stain flat out stared at him, and Izuku couldn't tell if he was impressed or angry, so he stayed quiet, pursing his lips together. "Why don't you come in and we can finish this conversation?" Stain suggested, pulling the door open all the way. Izuku hesitated, looking into the dark room behind Stain. It seemed like a really bad idea to just walk willingly into a villain's lair. "Is this a test?" he asked nervously. Stain chuckled. "No, but if it was, I'd be very impressed with you for hesitating." Izuku planted his feet in the hallway. "Then, I think I'd like to continue this conversation here, until we come to an agreement." Stain laughed, a sound almost like a low, throaty cough. "Smart. My last question, then. If I help you, what's in it for me?" Izuku looked at his feet, checking to make sure he actually wanted to go through with this. After a moment, he nodded to himself, deciding this was going to have to work, and brought his backpack around to his front. Stain watched curiously as he opened his yellow backpack and removed a stack of notebooks. I take notes on all the pro heroes I find interesting, Izuku explained, holding up the top one to demonstrate. These notebooks have their quirks, strengths, potential weaknesses, and potential improvements all listed, although I don't know how you'd use that one. Stain plucked the notebook out of the kid's hand, flipping through it with some interest. After a moment, he looked back up at him, impressed. You did this all yourself? Izuku nodded, reaching out to take the notebook back. I do have one condition though, he said, pulling it from Stain, who was clearly very reluctant to let it go. And what's that? You can have all my notes, photocopied, of course, not the originals, after and only after I've finished training with you, Izuku said. I don't want a direct hand in any of your business, he continued, throwing a glance down the hallway again, and I would strongly prefer it if nobody died while I'm out training with you. If you get my drift. Stain nodded slowly, considering the kid's condition. Very well, he said slowly. And when do you intend to finish? 10 months, Izuku said immediately. That's He cut himself off again as he remembered what Stain said about not revealing too much about himself. He'd been about to say that in 10 months, the UA entrance exam would be taking place, and everything would be decided, but that was too much information right now. That's when I'm going to high school, he finished vaguely. Stain smirked. Deal, he said, disappearing into his room. I'd assume we have to work around your middle school classes too. Which one do you go to? Aldra? Izuku was almost surprised Stain guessed that on the first go. Maybe there was some cool vigilante thing he'd learn about scouting new territory or something. That could be really cool. He nodded absent-mindedly. It's not rocket science, kid, Stain said, looking amused. He'd been muttering again. It's a good practice to spend a few days going over every inch of a city before you start committing crimes there, Stain said, leaning against the doorframe. Lowers your chances of getting caught. Aldra has some dumpsters in the back that are completely secluded from security cameras. Izuku knew that, he knew that. That's where all the bullies went. Lower chances of someone catching them if they beat people up back there. Anyway, Stain said, pushing off the wall and disappearing into his temporary home again. Just wait outside today after school, and we'll begin. He slammed the door in Izuku's face. Izuku stood in shock in front of the closed door. He was going to train under Stain. This was either the worst or the best decision he'd ever made. It was hard to tell which. But either way, he was going to train with the hero killer, who was arguably the best at hand-to-hand combat in Japan. He was just starting to turn away, shaking off his shock, when the door opened again and Stain poked his head out. Hey kid, he said. What should I call you? You can keep calling me kid, for now I guess, Izuku said, suddenly understanding what Stain had told him about not rambling. There was always a chance he'd tell the wrong information to the wrong people, and everything would go south. Stain's lips curled up in a smile. You learn fast. The door closed between them. Izuku gave the door a resolute nod, and started down the hallway. Later today he'd have training, but for now he had to get to school. Stain had been impressed, if not a little weirded out, by the kid that had knocked on his door at an ungodly hour of the morning. It took guts to go searching for a serial killer in the dark, it really did. And the kid had had that look in his eye, a look of determination coupled with desperation. He had copious amounts of sheer intelligence and practicality, and just one look in that crazy notebook was enough to show that he was observant and analytical. The only thing he was lacking was any semblance of physicality, but that could be fixed. All of that would serve him well as a hero, if he could get there. But as sad as it was, the kid was right. No pro hero would ever train a quirkless nobody with an unattainable dream of being a hero. Stain really was his only option. That's really what caught his eye about the kid. He wasn't trying to be a hero for the money, or the fame he could get that somewhere else, in a profession less biased towards quirks. He wanted to be a hero, and he was willing to jump hoops and bounds to get there. He was willing to tear down the entire structure of hero society just to be someone who saved people with a smile. Stain could already tell where the kid's ambition was going to lead him. The world would hate the kid for trying to be a quirkless hero, for trying to be special. It was inevitable. The kid would try to not let it get to him, he'd ignore it for as long as he could. But eventually he would reach a breaking point. Stain knew because he'd been there. He'd once been a kid with an unattainable dream too, because he had a villain's quirk, and how could he possibly be a hero if he needed to eat people's blood to use his quirk? He'd struggled and fought against society, but it was hard being one against all, and he'd lost that battle. That's when he'd started to realize what was wrong with society and hero culture. Surely if someone wants to save people, they should be accepted into the hero community without question. But because of the flashy nature of the hero world, and the popularity problems, and the government sponsorship, Stain couldn't ever have been a hero. He knew that now. So instead, he'd launched himself into trying to change the hero community, to make it embrace people who wanted to be heroes because they wanted to save people, like he once had. He'd been in this kid's position before. He'd seen the hating eyes and he'd fought against them. But even Stain had snapped, and inevitably this kid would too. And when he did, well, Stain would rather have all that anger on his side. Stain lurked outside the kid's school, waiting for him to show his face. He was hiding in the shadows of buildings on the fire escape, but it was hard escaping prying eyes and he couldn't watch all corners of the school at once. He hoped the kid would have some common sense and stay away from the front entrance, but he honestly didn't know how good the kid was at situational analysis. It was taking too long. The kid was either dead in there or he was getting beaten up, and Stain didn't like those options at all. He was starting to prepare plans to break in and extract him, when he heard light footsteps behind him. He whipped his head around, drawing a knife. It was just the kid, curly green hair falling into his freckled face. He looked like he'd been close to tears for quite some time, and he was holding his shoulder oddly. And now he was vaguely panicked, since Stain was pointing a knife at him. Stain-sensei? Surprised and impressed that the kid had gotten so close, and had had the foresight to go around the back way, Stain stared for a moment before dropping down to the ground, tucking the knife away. "Don't add the honorific, it's just Stain," he said, looking the kid over again. Something was definitely wrong with his arm. Choosing to ignore that fact right now, Stain slipped down the alley, smirking when he heard the kid padding after him. He definitely had a lot to learn about stealth, but he was keeping up with Stain reasonably well, which was a good sign. When they were far enough away from the school that Stain was back in his comfort zone, Stain abruptly turned around and grabbed the kid's shoulder. The kid gave a sharp intake of breath, tearing up. "That's what I thought," Stain said sharply. "What happened, who did it, and where do they live?" The kid looked somewhere between terrified and desperate. "I fell into the lockers at school and—" "Don't give me that, see," Stain scolded, pointing at the shoulder of the kid's uniform. It was hard to tell with the dark color of his uniform, but the fabric was a little rough there, like it had been scorched. "You were burned." The kid gave the ground a resigned frown. "They were just trying to tell me that I couldn't be a hero." "Still haven't answered the questions." He sighed, eyes flickering up to meet Stain's. That's because I don't want to," he said. Stain opened his mouth to demand an answer, when he caught the look in the kid's eye. There was pain, sure, but behind that pain he had a determined protection brewing. The kid wasn't going to tell Stain anything, because he was trying to save the people that hurt him. He was trying to protect his bullies. If that wasn't something a true hero would do, Stain didn't know what was. "Fine," he said shortly, grabbing the front of the kid's shirt. The kid looked terrified again, but Stain just pulled the shoulder of his uniform off and looked at the mark on his shoulder. It had a small second-degree burn just above his collarbone, like someone had cupped their hand over his shoulder and let out a contained explosion. It wasn't too bad, and even if Stain wasn't trying to avoid hospitals, he still probably wouldn't make the kid go to one. Still, it needed treatment, and Stain hadn't found a new home to commandeer for the day. Plus, the kid looked absolutely dead on his feet. Stain hadn't thought about how little sleep the kid must have gotten the night before, but now that the evidence was sitting right in front of him, he had to admit that the kid was clearly tired. "Are your parents home?" Stain asked finally, letting go of the kid's uniform. The kid's hand drifted up to hold his shoulder. Looking confused, the kid shook his head. "My dad is gone, and my mom's at a business meeting." "You're going to sneak me into your house?" Stain said decisively. The kid took a step back, eyes narrowed. "I am not going to do that," he said firmly. If he hadn't been annoyed with the kid for not accepting help when he clearly needed it, Stain might have been impressed. The kid was a fast learner, and he already understood Stain's lesson that one shouldn't just blindly trust people. "You are going to do that," Stain said, "and I'm going to fix your shoulder." The kid didn't move, still watching Stain suspiciously. "Could you just tell me how to do it myself?" he asked at last, relaxing a little. Sighing, Stain gave the kid step-by-step instructions on how to deal with his burns. The kid whipped out a notebook halfway through Stain's spiel and took fast notes, pencil practically flying across the page. When Stain had finished and dismissed him, the kid gave him a short little bow and scurried off, stuffing his notebook in his bag as he went. Stain was half tempted to tail the kid anyway, but he supposed there was a level of trust he was supposed to keep with the kid, and that meant he couldn't stalk him as much as he wanted to. Instead, he went on a hunt for a hero to kill. He did need to keep up appearances, after all. The next day, Stain was waiting for the kid in a different alley and found himself surprised when the kid managed to sneak up on him again, this time making it even closer than the day before. Either Stain was losing his touch, or the kid was getting better. Either way, it was impressive. Stain did another quick look over the kid and then nodded when he could see that the kid had managed to avoid getting bullied today. "Shoulder," he said gruffly, holding out a hand to push the uniform out of the way. The kid pulled the uniform down off his shoulder, letting Stain look at his work. It was neatly bandaged, neatly enough that Stain could tell it wasn't the kid's first time. "I wasn't going to bandage it, but I was worried my uniform would irritate it," the kid said, pulling his uniform back up over his arm. "I washed it out with cold water for a really long time, like you said, and then I kept it cool, so it's not swelling very much." Stain made a non-committal sound and then started down the alley, planning out a route. Stain-sensei?" "I mean Stain," the kid asked hesitantly, not following him. Stain stopped and looked over his shoulder, frowning. The kid looked nervous and apologetic, like he had something to say and was worried Stain would be mad. "I was just remembering that you don't like, working in the daytime much," the kid said, shuffling his feet a little. "And then, well, I was wondering if you, wanted to start meeting at night?" His body curved in on itself, like he was expecting to get hit. Stain wasn't going to hit him. "You're right, that's very observant," he said, nodding. The kid looked relieved, letting his shoulders relax a little. "How about tomorrow, instead of meeting here, you meet me at the skate park at 10. Then we can work on your balance and start learning how to jump from high things." The kid nodded a few times, clearly excited. "Okay," he started after Stain, radiating with energy. "So what are we going to do today?" Stain wasn't really used to being around bubbly teenagers. Any teenagers he'd met were usually put up with society and ready to murder someone. This was not that. It was kind of nice, actually. Just might take a while to get used to. "You are going to follow me around and I'm going to lose you." The kid nodded, a determined look in his eye, and Stain slipped off, vanishing into the shadows. After taking a halting step in the direction Stain had just gone in, the kid gave the alleyway a despairing look. "How did you do that?" he asked the empty alleyway. Stain had to keep himself from snorting out a laugh as he dropped down from the fire escape. "Let's try again." Nodding again, the kid narrowed his eyes, focusing them on Stain. Stain jumped off, trying to lose his tail, but the kid learned quickly and wasn't about to lose him again, not without a fight. He managed to keep up with Stain for a full minute before losing him again, and when Stain went back for him, he found the kid sitting in the middle of the alleyway, notebook in front of him, muttering as his pencil skimmed the page. "Seems to be using the shadows to his advantage, harder in the daylight, I bet, but not impossible, keeps his body lower to the ground so it's more out of eyeline. Uses height to his advantage, sometimes jumping and climbing the fire escapes and more than once used dumpsters to get up higher, although I do wonder how he does that without making noise." He kept going, muttering out all of Stain's tactics, and Stain watched, grinning. 2 hours later, the kid managed to follow Stain for 15 minutes without losing him once, even climbing a fire escape with his wimpy noodle arms at one point. Stain decided that was enough for the day when he realized the kid had been doing all of this with a backpack which was probably full of homework he had yet to do. After thanking Stain a million times, which was an odd experience to say the least. The kid vanished, using Stain's own stealth techniques to lose him. He really did learn quickly. Izuku wasn't sure how to feel about Stain. He'd been training with him for a few weeks now, and honestly, it wasn't that bad. Of course, there were times when he questioned the man's sanity, like his first parkour lesson. They had been at a skate park, which is where they did most of their "here's how you jump off a building and don't die" training, standing on the edge of a particularly high drop. Stain had said simply, "Today I'm going to teach you how to fall," before suddenly grabbing the back of Izuku's shirt and shoving him off the ledge. Naturally, he hadn't landed well, but Stain only said flatly, "That is not how you should take a fall," before jumping off the edge himself and falling into a perfect roll, coming up completely unharmed. So, yeah, the guy had some interesting training techniques. Training at night was way better than the weird alleyway chasing thing they'd done that first day. The first time Izuku tried following Stain at night, it had been exponentially more difficult, and he still couldn't follow him for longer than 10 minutes, although, to be fair, Stain was currently struggling with tailing Izuku longer than 20 minutes, so there was some clear improvement there. The only problem with the late-night training was that it meant he was a little bit more sleep-deprived, and that made him more vulnerable at school. Luckily, Stain was actually really conscientious of Izuku's time and the state of his health, and he intentionally built rest days and first aid training into their action-filled schedule. At first, Izuku had assumed the rest days were so Stain could go off and finish his business with heroes, but they happened too regularly to be entirely based on that, and anyway, Stain had finished his work in Mizutofu a while ago, and was now branching out into other districts, searching for his next group of targets. Izuku was working hard to ignore the fact that Stain killed people in his free time. It was surprisingly easy to forget. Stain wasn't actually that bad of a guy, once you looked past all the blood on his hands. He had some fascinating opinions on hero society, and more than once, Izuku's hands had itched for a pen while Stain was ranting, wanting to write down his crazy ideas. Actually, the more time Izuku spent with him, the more he grew to realize how similar their opinions on heroes were. Izuku was a lot more hesitant to lay praise on All Might than Stain, but putting that aside, they both agreed that hero society was growing corrupt in general. They could spend hours listing the crimes of dirty heroes and thinking of increasingly crazy plots to take down the Hero Commission, and they did. Both of them hated quirk discrimination with a passion, and if Stain wasn't so set on killing heroes he didn't like, Izuku honestly thought the two of them could be a fantastic vigilante team, tearing heroes and villains down from their pedestals by bringing light to the things they were hiding. Becoming a vigilante was looking increasingly appealing to Izuku. He wasn't a huge fan of fighting or punching things, but he felt like he could really make a difference with his computer. He'd unearthed his weak hacking skills and started building them up again. It quickly became apparent that he could find a lot of dirt on people when he really looked, which led to the realization that it wouldn't be that difficult for him to destroy careers from behind a computer. From behind his laptop screen, he had the power to find and spread information, to save lives, to move masses. In other words, he really liked hacking. Unfortunately, hacking wasn't everything. That's why he was training with Stain. Stain said that Izuku was naturally good with stealth and speed-based operations, and that with his size, he'd probably be well-suited to ambush-style fighting. That meant that he needed to know how to throw a punch, and he needed to be able to use weapons. The punching thing actually didn't take him that long to catch on to. After a few training sessions in which he'd spent the majority of the time feeling like nothing but a splat on the ground, he started to catch on to Stain's movements and match them. Of course, Izuku still couldn't hold a candle to Stain's skill level, but he could hold his own for a few minutes before becoming the splat. Also, as a result of training with a villain, Izuku fought dirty. Really dirty. It actually made him feel bad a few times, but as Stain said, if the only way you're going to beat your opponent is by gouging out their eyes, then you should go for it. On second thought, maybe that wasn't a great lesson. But either way, he learned quickly enough, and Stain seemed impressed. Then there was the matter of weapons. "I prefer blades," Stain told him, standing over a table with a large array of weapons spread across it. Izuku didn't know what most of them even were, to be honest. They were in Stain's current apartment he moved around every few days, hopping between buildings. He called it squatting, but Izuku thought that was a weird term to use to describe illegally living in someone's house while they were gone. Maybe space stealing would be a good term. Or bed borrowing. The alliteration was nice. The main reason I like them is because they're helpful to my quirk, Stain continued, picking up a long sword thing and running his finger along the side of it. There are lots of weapons you could use to immobilize people. Long range, close range, whatever you want. And I'm going to teach you the basics of how to use all of these. Then, whichever ones you like the best, we'll focus on. Izuku nodded numbly. He didn't really like the idea of cutting people, or shooting people, or hitting people with long sticks. That being said, he really did need to know how to fight, and having a large arsenal of weapons he knew how to use could really come in handy. Stain decided to start them out with knives, since they were his personal favorite. And actually, Izuku found that he liked them a lot. They were super easy to control, so he could pick how much damage he wanted to do. And he could throw them badly at the moment, but still so he could use them for long-range and short-range attacks. They were useful, easy to hide, and Stain happened to be very, very experienced with them, making him a great teacher. After a while of Izuku chucking knives at Stain and having them easily deflected, Stain made a grimace and told him to stop. "It seems unintentional," he said, "but you keep aiming at major arteries. How much do you know about anatomy?" It quickly came to light that Izuku knew close to nothing about anatomy. So, on top of all the other homework he had, Stain tasked him with learning about where exactly he could stick knives without worrying about blood loss. The other advantage to training under Stain came to light a few days later, at school. Izuku had recently been doing an excellent job of using his newfound stealth techniques to avoid his bullies, but there had been a couple times where it had been a close call. This time, he completely didn't notice their presence until Kaken grabbed his shirt and slammed him into the wall, keeping a firm hold on his shoulder. "Hey, shitty Deku," he snarled, lips twisted up in a sneer. "You been avoiding me, am a nerd?" Silently cursing himself for not paying more attention, Izuku instinctively grabbed Kaken's wrist and twisted outward, using Kaken's arm as a pivot point to smack him face first into the wall. He ducked under Kaken's friend's arms, intentionally stomping really hard on their toes as he passed, and used a couple of Stain's tricks to disappear into the crowd of students leaving school. It was after school hours and Kaken hated to admit he'd gotten beaten in a fight, so Izuku hoped he'd be safe from getting reported. And he was really grateful to Stain. Midoriya Inko would consider herself to be a pretty good mom. She'd been disappointed when Izuku got his diagnosis as quirkless, but mostly she'd just been upset that because her baby was born different, he'd get treated differently. She knew all about quirkism because when he didn't manifest a quirk at 4, she started looking into quirklessness. And the statistics were not good. Quirkless unemployment rates were in the 90% range. Out of estimated hate crimes against quirkless people, only about 10% were reported, and only 1% had legal follow-up. 1 out of every 3rd quirkless person committed suicide by the age of 20. 0% of quirkless people in the past 50 years lived past the age of 40. Inko didn't like those statistics. So when her baby got the quirkless diagnosis, she had no choice but to apologize and bawl into his arms. Because she loved her baby. And she didn't want to lose him because of something as stupid as bad genes. They'd been fine for a couple years. Izuku came home with scratches and burns sometimes, but he just seemed so happy, and he always wrote them off as just accidents that had happened when he was playing. Then one day he came home with a really bad 2nd-degree burn. She'd taken him to the hospital, fussing over him the entire way, and then had stood in complete shock in the waiting room as her baby was ignored for 6 hours because he was quirkless and other people with good quirks needed treatment first. Inko hadn't stayed in medical school for long before switching to journalism, but she'd gone long enough to know that a 2nd-degree burn as bad as Izuku's needed higher priority than a man with a concussion and a water jet quirk. Especially when egotistical water jet man had been at the hospital for 10 minutes, and Izuku had been there for 6 hours. 6 hours. What really worried her, however, was that Izuku wouldn't tell her what happened. And it just kept getting worse. She saw him trying to hide the injuries. She took out his trash and found old bandages. She saw how he hunched himself over, like he was in pain. She noticed the burns on his uniform when she did the laundry. She went through his search history once in a panic and found links to a lot of websites on how to self-treat minor injuries. When she called the school, they claimed they had no idea what she was talking about, but would keep an eye out for signs of bullying. They did not keep an eye out. Izuku's injuries got worse. One time, right after his 11th birthday, he came home with a cracked rib. And he still refused to tell her the truth about what was going on because he wanted to be a hero, and heroes didn't rat out their friends. Inko got him a therapist, but after the first session the therapist sent her an email explaining that he needed to focus on higher priority customers and would have to cancel their appointments for a while. Having heard all the euphemisms by now, Inko knew that meant Izuku had told the therapist he was quirkless, and the therapist had given up. She asked if he wanted to switch schools, and he broke her heart when he said it wouldn't matter if he did, because people would still hate him no matter where he was. So Inko had to sit and watch as the world beat her ray of sunshine down. She watched as he fought against the current of discrimination and stayed determined to save people. She watched as he struggled and adapted and grew. And because she was watching, she saw the day hope died in her baby's eyes. He came home one day without that sunshiny smile she didn't know she'd gotten used to. She'd seen the news, but he didn't seem to want to talk about what he'd done or how the heroes had treated him afterwards. He just vanished into his room. A few hours later, she found 2 boxes of All Might merch outside his door, with a post-it note declaring the boxes and their contents to be for donation. She didn't say anything about the boxes, even though she cried when she saw them. She just tucked the boxes into storage, hoping that this was just a phase, and it would pass. It didn't pass, but the next day Izuku came home from school absolutely exhausted and fell asleep immediately upon getting home. Well, immediately after standing in the bathroom with the tap running for 30 minutes. The day after that, Izuku came home with a spring in his step and a new light in his eyes. And as the weeks passed, something changed in her baby. He still claimed he didn't want the All Might merch anymore, so Inko decided to get rid of it. He started researching quirk laws, learning to program, going on runs in the morning, and practicing punches in the kitchen. He still wanted to be a hero, but there was a new determination behind it, as though he was doing it just to prove he could, instead of doing it so people could be comforted by his smile. At first Inko was worried because in the mornings, he'd leave his room with 10 new bruises on his face and he walked stiffly, like he'd overused his muscles. But then Izuku started gaining muscle mass and started padding soundlessly around the apartment, like he'd become a ninja overnight. And as he got stronger, those injuries started to disappear, along with the burns. As the injuries disappeared, so did his smile. Inko liked his smile. She wanted it back. It didn't come back. The weeks flew by with school by day and training by night. Izuku hadn't come home visibly injured in a while, and it was worth all of it, just to see the relief that simple difference brought to his mother. She didn't worry about him when he went to school anymore, and while they'd never openly discussed the bullying, he knew she could tell something was different. Meanwhile, with Stain, Izuku was making an impressive amount of progress. He was rapidly becoming a threat in hand-to-hand combat, an even bigger threat when he had knives, and while he had yet to beat Stain, he could keep up with him for several minutes before getting knocked down. Izuku was also now well-knowledged on first aid, anatomy, and law, all of which he figured he'd need as a hero. Stain had introduced him to all kinds of new weapons, giving a short presentation for each. These presentations were usually biased towards Stain's personal preferences, but that was easy to ignore. Izuku had already found his love for knives, throwing knives and katanas in particular, but there were so many more options. Beyond blades, he quickly found that he loved bows. Sadly, he had to agree with Stain about their impracticality and set that aside. His next favorite was, to his surprise and partial horror, guns. They were efficient, powerful, and exceptionally useful. On the other hand, it was incredibly easy to kill someone with a gun, and Izuku was struggling with the idea of using one in a fight, even if it was just to immobilize his opponent. Then again, there were all sorts of types of gun, and he could probably design bullets meant to incapacitate rather than destroy. The only other roadblock with guns was that Stain despised them, arguing they were too easy to abuse, and wouldn't, or couldn't, help Izuku learn to use them. Plus, handguns were illegal in Japan, and Izuku was having trouble finding loopholes in that particular law. So, Izuku turned to his next top option, the bow staff. The bow staff was elegant, swift, and blunt. It was a tool easy to incorporate into Izuku's training in hand-to-hand and martial arts. He could easily knock someone out with it without worrying about them bleeding out. It wasn't hard to carry around, especially with the modernized, collapsible version he was training with. And Stain didn't mind teaching him how to use it. But, around the same time Izuku started training with the bow staff, Stain started killing again. The hero killer hadn't attacked anyone since the week he started teaching Izuku, and the news tabloids had noticed. They weren't making a huge deal about it, but there were some conspiracy theories spiraling around regarding Stain's disappearance. Izuku also noticed. Ever since the day he met Stain, he watched the news carefully, paying attention to anything related to his mentor. After weeks of nothing, he started to get hopeful that Stain was done, and that being a teacher had somehow miraculously been a good influence on him. Then, as Izuku started growing into a better fighter, Stain struck again, murdering the pro-hero Skydancer in the next district over with no warning whatsoever. Staring at his computer in shock, Izuku had to wonder why this surprised him. He'd known Stain was a killer, but now that he'd actually begun to understand and, dare he say it, like the man, it was hard to mesh together the two mental images in his head. One half of his brain was pointing at the carnage in the alley Skydancer's body was found in and screaming at Izuku for not turning Stain in the moment he had a chance. That was the side of his brain which had, for all his life, been obsessed with good and evil, the shining gold line between right and wrong. It made him want to be a hero so he could protect the light from the darkness and make people look up at him in awe, feeling safe. The other half of his brain pushed aside the image of Stain's extracurriculars and pointed at the man Izuku had come to respect and empathize with. It insisted that there wasn't a line between right and wrong, there was a cloud. A big gray cloud of ambiguity. This side of his brain wanted him to look at Stain and see a man who'd made mistakes, but still had potential to learn and grow into someone better. It wanted Izuku to be a hero so he would look at the world with compassion, and understand that nothing was black and white, that everyone, including the villains, needed saving. And some of the heroes needed condemning. Izuku wasn't sure which side to listen to. He wanted to like Stain, he really did, but he couldn't be friends with someone who murdered people in his free time. There wasn't any moral ambiguity about killing people because he didn't like their motivations. That was so clearly wrong. But then there was the Stain who laughed at Izuku's weak jokes, and didn't care that he was quirkless, and encouraged him to be better for no other reason than that Izuku wanted to be better. So there had to be some sort of compromise. As Izuku glumly pulled on a hoodie and grabbed his throwing knives, he considered. But there was nothing. There was no way for him to ignore murder for the sake of friendship. He dropped to the ground outside his window, mind whirring. Letting Stain continue killing heroes was out of the question. Stain's murder habit was wrong. But his ideals, while extreme and far-fetched, were in the right place. If Izuku could somehow convince Stain to give up the murdering portion of the job, and target actually immoral heroes, all this confusion would be cleared up. Izuku might not particularly like the idea of Stain beating heroes up, but it was a step in the right direction away from straight-up killing them, so it would have to do. The only problem he had now was how to convince the guy to quit it. Stain could be painfully stubborn sometimes. It hit him as he left the bus station. Martyrs. He parkoured the rest of the way to Stain's apartment, wincing as his brain helpfully recited all the trespassing laws he was breaking and what loopholes he could potentially use to get out of legal retaliation. Swinging in through the window, he found Stain on the computer, muttering angrily to himself as he read an article titled, "The Hero Killer Strikes Again." Well, at least he was in a good mood for this conversation to work. Izuku said intelligently, announcing his presence. Stain's head snapped up and he glared, before returning to the article. "You know, it would probably be easier to get people to like you if you didn't kill heroes," Izuku told him, crossing the room with his arms outstretched for the bow staff. He'd been separated from it for too long. "I'm surprised you came back," Stain said finally. "I actually came back to take this staff from you and argue with you," he answered honestly. He was intentionally trying to keep his voice light, Like doing that would somehow make it easier to have this conversation. Ready for some constructive criticism? Stain made a noncommittal noise. You can't kill people anymore, Izuku said simply. Why not? Stain asked, looking genuinely angry. I'm trying to get a point across. Yeah, I get that, he said, nodding. But you're doing it wrong. I'm not. Shut up and let me explain. Stain slumped back into his chair, arms crossed like a pouting toddler. Izuku sighed, twirling his staff around his hand a few times while he collected his thoughts. Look, he said. What you're doing right now looks like needless murder. You're taking people that the majority of Japan looks up to and you're killing them off. I'm trying to show that they're unworthy. Stain protested. Well, you have to prove it before you kill them. Izuku countered, scowling. You can't just kill heroes with an unfounded claim that they're unworthy and expect everyone to get it. So I'm going to tell you what a better way to do it is. Ready? Stain just glared at him. First, you've got to start getting people to trust you. Right now, all people see is this crazy psychopath who hates every hero except All Might, who, by the way, also isn't really that great of a hero. So you need to start digging up facts. Find things out. For example, Skydancer originally became a hero so she could hide a drag trading operation under her agency. You didn't even know that because you didn't look. The rest of the world definitely didn't know that, and they never will, because you killed her. Right now you're just killing every hero who isn't All Might. But if you find genuinely condemning information about heroes and then spread that information before you attack, you'll find that a lot more people are going to start supporting you. It'll change from, Stain's a crazy guy who runs around randomly killing heroes and no one can stop him, to, Stain's helping expose immoral heroes and putting them out of commission. Which leads me to my next point, Izuku said, pointing his staff at Stain and rubbing his forehead tiredly. Stain was still glaring at him, not moving, so he honestly couldn't tell if any of this was getting through to him. You have to stop killing them. All you're doing by killing them is making a long list of martyrs. You're taking these awful people and you're giving them the chance to live on in the history books as people who honorably died trying to defeat the hero killer. And if you find reasonable proof before they die, people are going to want to destroy those heroes themselves. Want to know what the one thing more satisfying than blood is? He asked, eyes glinting dangerously. Turning the entire world against someone and watching them burn. Izuku knew that was true because that's what Kaken did. He hurt Izuku himself, until he decided that wasn't enough, and then he turned the entire school against him instead. It looked very satisfying. If Izuku wasn't so weak and useless, he'd probably want to try it on his bullies. That's what the media is for, Izuku continued vehemently. The media was literally designed to find this stuff out and tear people apart for it. So if you give the media information, they're going to go crazy. But I want to personally watch the light leave their eyes, Stain said flatly, still not moving. I want to be the one to purge them from this world. So beat them up, Izuku said. He hated the words as they came out of his mouth, but knew this was the only way to get Stain to stop killing people. Destroy their lives without killing them. Make it impossible for them to continue being a hero without taking anything else from them. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he decided whether or not he wanted to go through with this. But it was the only way, so he opened them again and looked Stain dead in the eye. Captain Celebrity, he said, keeping his voice as steady as possible, is arguably the worst hero in the world. He comes to Japan for the sole purpose of raping Japanese women. He's also here right now. I can give you an exact location, actually. But I want you to do something for me. Instead of killing him, I want you to stab his back in just the right spot so he has full body paralysis, but doesn't die. You know the one I'm talking about. Stain nodded. You are going to hit him there, and then you are going to leave him where someone will find him. You are going to write a note about why exactly Captain Celebrity deserves that treatment, and you are going to leave it there. You are not going to kill him. I'll give you all the relevant facts and statistics you need to write before you leave. Then you are going to call a media outlet. It doesn't matter which one, but the bigger the better. You're going to give them Captain Celebrity's location. They'll come, they will find your note, and I can assure you, Captain Celebrity will never be the same again. Izuku took a shaky breath and released it, well aware he was almost done and then he could go home and have nightmares by himself. Just this once, I'm going to tell you to do this, okay? Just this one time. If you hate it, I'll get out of your life and you can go back to killing people in peace. Okay? Stain gave him a long, calculating look and then stood up. You're trying to be a hero, he said, and you're telling me to go beat up a hero? A sexist, racist, dickhead of a hero. Izuku spat before he could think about what he was saying. He slapped his hand over his mouth immediately afterward, shocked at his own words. But Stain just laughed. You're more of a hero than any of them, kid. Izuku gave him a shaky nod, not really sure if that was a compliment. So, where is this guy? On the bus the next morning, Izuku stared at his phone in shock as the media went crazy. For once, the fact that the hero killer had killed someone wasn't the headline. It was all about Captain Celebrity, tearing him apart, analyzing his past, and, for some, blaming America for creating shitty heroes. Izuku could live without that last part, but he had to admit, seeing the worst hero ever getting what was coming to him was kind of satisfying. The guy was paralyzed from the neck down, he was facing serious legal repercussions from both Japan and America, and his wife had filed for a divorce already. He was definitely not loving life right now. It took Izuku almost the whole bus ride to find the original story, the first one to have been run. He looked at the picture curiously to see that Stain had decided to leave his note using Captain Celebrity's blood on the wall, which was typical of him. Izuku should have guessed that Stain would take his words and make them super dramatic. Again, though, the article was less about Stain's involvement and more about how terrible Captain Celebrity was, and how he never should have become a hero in the first place. It seemed that the whole world was questioning hero society and justice in general. They were asking the right questions like what exactly makes a hero and is there a better way for us to determine the worth of a person? Izuku felt a little twinge of pride as he kept reading. Then he realized what he was doing and he completely shut off his phone, feeling guilt sweep over him as the bus pulled into his school station. He'd paralyzed someone. He'd ruined someone's life. Indirectly, but still. What on earth was he thinking? Was Captain Celebrity a shitbag? Did that mean that he deserved the havoc Izuku had just wreaked on his life? Izuku honestly couldn't bring himself to say no, as much as his brain was scolding him. He couldn't find it in himself to pity a guy who had done so much evil. So did he regret it? Not really. But shouldn't he? Shouldn't he feel sorry for being the reason Captain Celebrity's quality of life had just plummeted? The guy was paralyzed and absolutely no one wanted to help him at this point. He'd be lucky if he lived through the next year. Sighing, Izuku stepped out of the bus station. Sometimes he wished there was someone he could talk to about this stuff. Someone that wasn't Stain, who was probably crowing triumphantly on the rooftops right now as people finally started to get his point. Someone who wasn't his mom, who didn't have any idea what was going on. Someone who wasn't Kaken, who just caught sight of Izuku outside of school and was making a beeline for him, face screwed up angrily. I really need a normal friend, Izuku decided as he ducked under Kaken's right swing and stepped lightly past him, heading for the school building. He entered the gates with another sigh, hearing Kaken's angry footsteps stomping up behind him. The air shifted behind him, sending a little tingle down his neck, and he ducked at the last second, hair ruffling slightly as Kaken's fist passed just over his head. Hey, Kaken, he said brightly, turning around and baring his teeth in a false smile. Kaken had been making increasingly desperate attempts to punch Izuku lately, and had been failing miserably. It was clearly very frustrating for him, and he hadn't seemed to have figured out yet that there were better ways to hurt people than hitting. I have a question for you, Izuku said lightly, easily deflecting Kaken's next punch to the side with his wrist. After training with Stain, this wasn't hard at all. Kaken always broadcasted his moves, making him exceptionally easy to predict. At least, easy to predict compared to a seasoned serial killer. Do you think it's better to let bad people do bad things, or take it into your own hands by breaking some laws, tearing apart their bodies, and destroying their public image? Kaken just growled, leaping forward with his hands outstretched to try to tackle Izuku to the ground. That was okay. Izuku didn't need him to answer, because he already knew his answer. He would choose the second one, no questions asked. That was just the kind of person he was, someone who wouldn't just stand by and watch a villain hiding in plain sight. Izuku used to admire Kaken for hating villains so much. He used to think it was the coolest thing, how Kaken wanted to be a hero so he could beat up the bad guys. He used to think Kaken had his life all figured out, and he was going to be the greatest hero ever. Now he wasn't so sure. Someone who acted like Kaken did around Izuku couldn't possibly be a great hero. If Izuku saw a hero today, acting the way Kaken did, he'd probably set Stain on them next. People didn't deserve to be treated like dirt, even if they had weak quirks. Even if they were villains. Everyone deserved another chance. Even Captain Celebrity. Izuku sidestepped Kaken's tackle attempt, allowing him to face-plant on the ground where a pair of red shoes had been a moment ago. Then, brushing his spotless uniform off, he continued to class. Maybe that was what he should have given Captain Celebrity. A chance to restart. Stain probably wouldn't have jumped on that idea, though, so maybe it would have been pointless to try. Anyway, he had said he'd stop messing around with Stain's work now. That meant he could start trying to fix things himself, in his own way. It was too late for Captain Celebrity, but he could figure out how to give other immoral heroes the chance to restart. He'd have to be delicate with it though. He'd have to have a plan. Hey, worthless Deku, mutter much? He really needed a friend to shoot ideas at, because muttering about destroying people's reputations in class wasn't going to cut it. School went by quickly, and homework even more quickly. Izuku was distracted all day, trying to figure out how to force heroes to rethink their lives and motivations. He kept finding himself continually hitting dead ends. It was really annoying. The only thing he could think of consistently was blackmail, but he didn't want to blackmail heroes into changing their lives. He wanted them to find motivation themselves. He wanted to teach them what was wrong and inspire them to fix it, not force them to do stuff for unknown reasons. The problem was Izuku wasn't powerful enough to do that. If he was someone like Nizu, maybe he could do it. But he wasn't Nizu, he was just a quirkless high schooler who got bullied and tried too hard on his homework. He was just some kid with not half-bad analysis skills. No one wanted him around and no one was going to listen to anything he had to say. Quirkless meant useless in this world, and he wasn't ever going to get people to listen to him and take his thoughts seriously. He was all alone, and he would never be able to be a truly great hero. Needless to say, he was in a bit of a bad mood when he got to Stain's temporary apartment that night. Stain was not in a bad mood. In fact, Stain was, predictably, in a very good mood. "I'm never doubting you again, kid," he announced, taking a swig from an unlabeled bottle that Izuku thought was probably some form of alcohol. Stain didn't look drunk, so Izuku wasn't particularly worried, but it was definitely different, seeing him drinking. He'd sort of started picturing Stain as someone super uptight about staying sober, but maybe even idealistic serial killers splurged sometimes. "I'm glad it worked out for you," Izuku said flatly, expanding and collapsing his bow staff several times. Stain seemed to notice Izuku was not having a good night. His expression softened, and he set his unlabeled bottle down on the table, leaning in. "What's going on?" Izuku made a frustrated noise in the back of his throat and violently started swinging his bow staff around, going through his practice strikes while ignoring the way the staff occasionally hit the ceiling. Stain was kind enough not to comment on his sloppy form, but he wasn't nice enough to change the subject. "Why do you even keep me around?" Izuku yelled finally, giving up with his unproductive attempts at deflecting the conversation and chucking his staff across the room. "What's even the point? I'm just a stupid quirkless Deku kid, and I can't help anyone with anything. This whole thing is just stupid. Why on earth did I think I could be a hero? No one's going to want me to be a hero, they're all going to hate me for my entire life, and they'll be right to because Okay, I'm gonna just stop you right there," Stain interrupted, holding up a hand. "First of all, don't throw the bow around like that, because it's not meant to be used like that, and need I remind you, this isn't actually my house. Second, yeah, everyone's going to hate you, so what?" Izuku stared at him. "What do you mean so what?" he shrieked, flinging his hands up in the air in exasperation. "How am I supposed to be a hero if everyone hates me?" Stain blinked at him a few times, frowning. "Remind me why you want to be a hero?" Wilting a little, he answered, "So I can save people." "So what does that have to do with people liking you?" Stain shrugged, leaning back in his chair. As far as I'm concerned, you don't even have to be a legitimate hero to save people. Vigilantes save people. Also, people notoriously don't like underground heroes, and they save people all the time. Being a flashy hero is overrated. You don't ever attack underground heroes, Izuku realized suddenly. Yeah, because they're not usually immoral asshats. They're in this business because they legitimately want to help people. It's admirable. Okay, but other heroes won't like me either. A lot of hero work is about team-ups, and no one's going to want to work with the quirkless loser. Stain looked unimpressed. Why wouldn't they like you? Because I'm quirkless, he answered, getting frustrated. It wasn't that difficult to understand. What does that have to do with anything? Izuku wished he still had his staff in his hand so he could throw it at the wall or at Stain's head. That has everything to do with everything. People don't like me when they know I'm quirkless, it's just a fact of. I like you, Stain said simply. Effectively cut off, Izuku stared at him. What? I like you. And I know you're quirkless, so, he raised his eyebrows, clearly trying to prove a point. But Izuku couldn't understand it. People who knew he was quirkless didn't ever like him, except maybe his mom. They tolerated him, sure, but like him? Even the suggestion that Stain could possibly want him around was strange. Why? He asked, completely flabbergasted. Stain shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal, like he wasn't completely blowing Izuku's mind right now. You're smart. You're determined to do what you set out to do, and you have a good heart. Why wouldn't I like you? Because I'm quirkless. My quirk requires me to drink someone's blood for it to activate, Stain said dryly. That doesn't seem to bother you. But you have a quirk. And you don't. Big deal. Izuku's eyes started to burn with coming tears. It is a big deal, he choked out. All I've ever wanted is a quirk so people would want me around, and I could be actually useful. And I'm telling you, you can be useful without one. Izuku held Stain's eyes until his tears spilled over and he had to wipe them away. Never in his entire life had someone told him he didn't need a quirk to be helpful. He'd always tried to believe it himself, of course, trying to force it to be a reality through sheer force of will, but no one had ever told him it was actually possible. Or if they had, it was in a pitying sort of way, like they were only saying it to make him happy. Everyone always looked at him with sad eyes when they figured out that this kid, glowing with intelligence and potential, didn't have a quirk. It had always been that the moment people realized he didn't have a quirk, they knew he would never amount to anything. His mother had done it the day he got his diagnosis, his bullies had done it the day after, his teachers had done it from the day he started school, that therapist he tried once had done it during their first session. All Might had done it on that rooftop. No one had ever believed in him before. So why was it that the only person in the entire world who was looking at Izuku like he could actually accomplish something was a serial killer? Okay, we're taking a break today, kid, Stain said, standing up and stretching out his back. You're too worked up to do staff drills right now, and I don't want to fight you while you're all unstable and teenager. Why? Want to go get ice cream or? I don't know what you like to do for fun. TP your least favorite teacher's house. Izuku didn't respond, still staring at Stain in shock. Kid? He asked, looking concerned. Shaking himself out of his trance, Izuku said quietly, Deku. You can call me Deku. He crossed the room in search of his bow staff. Deku? Stain repeated, sounding bewildered. Like Dikairu? You can do it. Staff in hand, Izuku turned around, meeting Stain's confused eyes. Like Dekunabu. Useless. An angry expression set in on Stain's eyebrows. Your parents named you after the word useless? No, my bullies did, Izuku said, absent-mindedly spinning the staff over his elbow and catching it on the other side. But I kind of like it. He gave Stain the smallest of smiles. It's going to help me remember that I can still make a difference, even though everyone else thinks I'm useless. I want it to remind me of the stereotype I'm working to defeat. A smile started across Stain's face too. Really though, he continued, expression going serious. Ice cream? What do teenagers do for fun? Izuku shook his head apologetically. You're asking the wrong person. I don't have any friends. Stain gave him a stern look. We're going to have to fix that then. Izuku really wasn't sure what was going on anymore. One minute, he'd been crying to Stain about how much everyone hated him not for the first time, of course, and the next, Stain was pulling his hood over his eyes and doing his best to make Izuku look inconspicuous. When he was satisfied with Izuku's appearance, and after Izuku had quickly grabbed his throwing knives and first aid kit just in case, Stain commenced to drag him down back alleys, muttering about some guy he really wanted him to meet. Don't comment on his scars, he has a lot of them. Actually, just try not to give him any weird looks at all, just talk to him like you would anyone else. I wouldn't recommend asking about his quirk, at least not until he brings it up. And whatever you do, do not bring up Endeavor, Stain warned him, unless it's to pass on his name. Izuku nodded, not that Stain was paying any attention. Releasing his arm, Stain jumped for a fire escape, grabbing the bottom of it and swinging his legs up to land gracefully on the first platform. Izuku followed him up a second later, using a nearby dumpster to give him some height so he could scramble onto the platform. It was much less graceful than Stain's method, but Izuku didn't have the arm strength to do a muscle-up, so he had to find a different way up. And anyway it worked. Stain climbed up 2 more levels and then pushed open a window, dropping inside. Frowning curiously, Izuku poked his head through the window. It looked like a bar, which was a weird place to bring a teenager in the middle of the night. It wasn't completely full of people, but the people that were there seemed to take up a lot of space with the amount of power and malice radiating off of them. Almost everyone was wearing hoods or masks, and they were all eyeing each other suspiciously, even while they were talking, like they were trying to size up everyone else in the room. Izuku got the idea that maybe this wasn't a place where nice people came to hang out, which meant he was about to walk straight into a hellhole. Good thing he'd thought to bring his knives. He slipped in the window after Stain, purposefully making his landing as soft as possible so no one noticed him. Some people did, but they seemed to be looking at him more for the purpose of analyzing the level of threat he posed than anything else. Stain crossed confidently over to the bar, eyes darting around carefully. Izuku tailed along behind him, doing his best to go unseen. He wasn't really sure it worked, but he was suddenly really grateful Stain was here with him, because no one was paying attention to the short kid in the hoodie. All eyes were on Stain. People seemed to recognize him, and were either watching him with trepidation or excitement. Something to drink, sugar? The bartender asked as they approached, leaning against the counter and looking at Izuku with some interest. I'm underage, Izuku stuttered. The bartender raised his eyebrows in disbelief and looked over at Stain. Did he really just say that? Stain shrugged. The bartender returned his gaze to Izuku, tipping his head to the side thoughtfully. A bit uptight about laws, are we? Izuku suddenly felt like he was getting tested for his ability to make snippy comments, so he gathered himself together and shot back, some of them. Only some. It's not a bad thing to be picky. But if you break one law, why not break them? Well, if you can get away with breaking one, why risk breaking another? The bartender laughed, tipping his head back and pushing away from the counter. I like you, he said, grinning. Feel free to come back whenever you want. He wiggled his eyebrows. You don't even have to get a drink. Laughing again, he turned to Stain. Something for you, then, Stendhal? No. You make weird concoctions, and I'm not in the mood for an experiment. Some people like them. Stain didn't seem to believe that was possible, but he just changed the subject. See Dobby today? He jerked his thumb to the back of the bar. Back. Thanks. Stain seized Izuku's arm and started dragging him to the back. Just reminding you one last time, do not bring up Endeavor. Breathless, Izuku nodded. He felt like he'd been being dragged around all night, and he honestly had no idea what was happening. They were here to make friends? With a heavily scarred guy who hated Endeavor? What? They got to the back and Izuku instantly saw what Stain had meant about the scars because holy hell, the guy had a lot of them. Or, really, just one big one, a burn scar which spread from the lower half of his face down under his shirt and became visible again on his arms, making him look a little bit like a patchwork quilt. His skin was literally stapled together, and while Izuku was making a concerted effort not to stare, it was difficult when he wanted to ask why on earth he hadn't gotten stitches instead. When Izuku managed to look away from the scars, he was met with piercing blue eyes, and a lot of tufty black hair, dyed from the looks of it. "Dabi," Stain said, slapping the scarred man across the back excitedly and pulling a chair up next to him. Dabi didn't look at him, keeping his eyes fixed on Izuku's, but Stain didn't seem to notice. Come to think of it, Izuku hadn't seen him this excited in a while, if ever. "It's been a long time." 2 months, Dabi said shortly, still not moving his gaze from Izuku's eyes. "A long time," Stain agreed. Izuku's eyes were starting to water now, because he wasn't blinking. Breaking eye contact with this guy, even for a second, suddenly seemed like the scariest thing in the world. "Who's your friend?" Dabi asked tonelessly, head tipping to the side slightly. A shiver went down Izuku's spine. "That's Deku." Surprised, Izuku blinked. Smirking, Dabi looked away, like he'd just won something, but Izuku didn't care. Stain had called him Deku. Deku's in debt. He hadn't been expecting the name to sound so different in the mouth of someone he trusted, but now that Stain had called him Deku for the first time, he never wanted to go back to being Kid again. "Hi," he squeaked, bowing a little bit. Dabi raised an eyebrow and looked at Stain again. Stain just sighed. "Yeah, I know. We're working on it." "Politeness is for prigs and heroes," Dabi told Izuku, leaning back in his chair. "Drop the bow in the greeting and just claim your territory, or you're going to get killed." "Who cares?" Izuku asked honestly. Because, seriously, who would care if he was killed? His mom, maybe, but he always felt more like a burden to her than anything else. She'd probably be relieved she didn't have to deal with him being around anymore. Kaken would care, but only because he'd have lost his favorite punching bag. Stain sighed again, a lot more heavily this time. "Kid, how many times do I have to say this? I care. Don't die on me." "I wouldn't die on you," Izuku protested, taking Dabi's advice and grabbing a chair without asking. "I'd die in a nearby alley and you'd have to come find my cold, dead body." Dabi snorted as Stain gave Izuku an annoyed look. "Where did you find this kid?" Dabi snickered, leaning forward again and resting his elbows on the table. "He found me," Stain answered, matching Dabi's smirk. "Impressive," Dabi said, looking Izuku up and down again, eyebrows quirked up with interest. Not really?" Izuku said, feeling his shyness coming up again. "I just hacked into some security cameras near his recent kills and went through the backlogs and followed him through the cameras until I lost track of him. Then I went through nearby buildings and looked for places he might be staying. I narrowed it down to 6, I think." Dabi and Stain were both looking at him strangely, and his shoulders started to hunch up as he curled in on himself in embarrassment. Were they mad that he'd traced Stain like that? "That your quirk?" Dabi asked finally. He shook his head, pursing his lips together. This was it. This was when all of Stain's plans of Izuku getting friends got chucked out the window. Everyone always left when they found out he was quirkless. So Dabi was going to ask what his quirk was, and he'd have to tell him the truth, and then Dabi would leave. To his surprise, all Dabi said was, "Even more impressive." He took a long drink out of his glass, which was filled with something bright blue. Izuku didn't think it looked very good, but it must have done something, because Dabi's eyes were brighter when he set it down again. "Think you could do that with Endeavor?" Izuku felt his body start to tense up, Stain's warning screaming repeatedly in his head. "I mean, Endeavor's not really that hard to track. He kind of goes everywhere with a big, boom." Dabi waved that away with one hand. "Yeah, but do you think you could predict when he'd be the most vulnerable? Do you think you could go digging into his personal life? Could you find incriminating information on him?" "Carefully, ever so carefully," Izuku responded. "I think I could find a lot of incriminating information on him, but I'm not comfortable with sharing that information." To his relief, Dabi's expression stayed the same, interested and slightly amused. He didn't look disappointed or upset at Izuku's unwillingness to share information on heroes. "Even if I did," Izuku continued, taking confidence in Dabi's reaction, or lack thereof, "I don't think it would do much. The public is on his side right now, and taking him out would shatter hero society, as hold on." He pressed his hands into the side of his head. Endeavor was really bad. Not like Captain Celebrity bad, to Izuku's knowledge, but still, not a good hero. How much would it take to knock him out of the top? And how much chaos would that create? If he could slowly start to turn the public's eye against Endeavor, if he could slowly manipulate society into looking at Endeavor and seeing a bad hero in a top spot, instead of a powerful quirk doing a hero's job, then he could change the way the entire world viewed quirks. He could revolutionize hero society, he could make people want to change, he could use the chaos it created to. All that would come at a cost. There was a distinct possibility that all of that planning and manipulating would cause the dominoes to fall in the wrong direction, or cause half of them to fall but not the rest, pinning Japan in a sort of in-between state where no one knew who to trust anymore. That possibility was too big to ignore, and the results of the chaos made by destroying Endeavor would be severe. And anyway, Endeavor needed a chance to change too, Izuku tried to remind himself forcefully. Everyone needed a chance to be better. Second chances. Important. He shook his head and returned his gaze to Dabi, who was smirking at him again. Sorry, that's a no. Ah, it's fine, Dabi said, placing both hands casually behind his head and leaning back in his chair again. It was fun listening to. You muttered to yourself, anyway. Izuku blushed, but Dabi honestly didn't seem to mind that he'd been thinking out loud. Let me know if you find anything super interesting though, yeah? I'll be here. Izuku nodded, pretty sure he would not be doing that. But he kind of liked Dabi, and he didn't want to make him angry or disappointed, so he'd definitely consider it. And he could maybe do some digging into Endeavor for him, just in case. Friends, Stain said, nodding. When Dabi rolled his eyes, Izuku choked out a laugh, hiding it behind one hand. Dabi's eyes widened in surprise, and then he grinned, staples stretching oddly. When did you get so sappy? Dabi asked Stain, getting cocky as he took his disgusting-looking blue drink in his hand again and took another drink. The day I met you, Stain answered without a second's hesitation. He stood up. Now give each other your phone numbers like good teenagers and then Deku, come outside and throw a knife at my face. Izuku nodded eagerly, searching around for something to write his phone number really quickly on so he could go throw knives. Instead, Dabi stood up, towering over the table as Izuku gawked. He hadn't realized how tall Dabi was. He was probably only about 10 centimeters taller than Izuku, but still. That was a lot of centimeters. Too many. Nah, it's fine. If you don't mind, I'd like to watch you throw knives at each other. He jabbed a finger at his blue drink. I'm not sure exactly what's in this, but it's weird and I don't like the idea of blacking out before I get home. Does it taste good? Izuku asked curiously. Clearly making a concerted effort to not smile, Dabi shook his head. Kid, people don't drink because it tastes good, they drink because of how it makes them feel. And I don't particularly like the feeling of being passed out in the street, so, he raised his eyebrows like he'd just proved a point. Izuku hopped to his feet. He didn't really get the appeal of drinking, but maybe that's because he'd never tried it. And no, he wasn't going to try it today. Following Stain back through the building, he glanced back at Dabi, who was tailing them at a relaxed pace, hands in his pocket. Izuku wasn't sure that he'd consider Dabi a friend, but he was definitely an enigma. And Izuku liked puzzles. He especially liked solving them. Maybe he would look into Endeavor after all. Dabi didn't know what to think about this new friend. Any protege of Stain he probably would have taken an immediate liking to, but this kid was so bright-eyed and innocent. It was cute, in a sort of sad way, like he was a little flower all by himself on top of a dirty pile of trash. It made him stand out like a sore thumb in that bar though, so Dabi was glad Stain had the foresight to drag him out of there before people could start getting ideas on what they could do to such a naive little green rabbit. But then there was another side to the kid that Dabi hadn't immediately recognized at first glance, and probably would have missed if he hadn't been paying attention. The way the kid switched between shy stuttering words and witty, truly intelligent remarks. The way the kid's eyes shifted around the room, like he was taking in all available information and thinking of ways to counteract anything that could go wrong. How he stopped to think before he answered questions, clearly analyzing the question itself, possible answers, the correct answer, and then the answer that his audience would want to hear. How he held his body like he was expecting he was going to need to take a hit. All of that made Dabi think that he did not want to be on the wrong side of this kid in a fight. And he didn't even know his quirk. Or how old the kid was, although he looked like a 12-year-old. But he didn't need to know those things to know that the kid wasn't someone he wanted against him. That's how dangerous the piece of broccoli was. Deku, he'd said his name was. Funny name, Dabi thought, but then again, who was he to judge? But the strangest thing about the kid, even after all of that, was his laugh. Dabi hadn't realized how little Deku was laughing, or even smiling, until all of a sudden he'd laughed at something Stain had said, and Dabi finally saw what he was missing. Because Diamond the kid had a nice laugh. It was just like sunshine. But he'd hidden it behind his hand, and immediately after, he'd looked around, as though worried someone would be angry. Dabi knew that feeling. He'd felt it every day, when he was still living with the biggest zit on the butt of all humanity. Luckily, Deku didn't seem to be an Endeavor fan, so Dabi felt relatively sure he wasn't going to need to punch him anytime soon. Dabi followed him and Stain out of the bar, once again getting the feeling that the kid's eyes were sweeping over everyone in the room, picking them apart. Stain led them a few alleys down, slipping through the shadows, and if Dabi hadn't been tracking Deku, who was slightly less subtle, he probably would have gotten lost by now. They stopped, and Dabi leaned against the wall, trying to look casual as Deku pulled out a bunch of throwing knives, looking them over carefully. "Did you really mean you want me to throw it at your face?" he asked Stain, sounding anxious. "Because I'm getting better and I really don't want to hit you." There was that innocent side again. Incredible how he turned it on and off like a light switch. Amazing and terrifying at the same time. Seemed to be a theme with the kid. "I'll deflect it," Stain said confidently. Deku didn't look so sure about that. "I don't mean to tell you what to do, but I don't think you're going to be able to. Just throw a knife already." Stain growled. With a tiny squeak, Deku nodded and threw the knife. It took a slow trajectory, and Stain was easily able to knock it aside long before it had any chance of hitting him in the face. Dabi was unimpressed. The kid had seemed to think he could throw a knife Stain wouldn't be able to deflect. "Not like that." Stain snapped. "Do it like you mean it." Oh, so he could, but he was holding back. He released a heavy sigh, pulling out another knife. "Fine." The knife flashed and Stain's eyes widened. He managed to duck to the side at the last minute, but the knife still skimmed across his forehead, cutting a long, thin gash there. "Holy F dash," he exclaimed, looking excited. "You've gotten way better, kid. You don't get to throw them at me anymore." "I'm so sorry I hit you," the kid said, looking worried. "You said you could." "I'm not mad," Stain assured him as Deku produced a first aid kit out of nowhere and ran over to him, fingers already fumbling for gauze. "I'm impressed. You've improved a lot and it's only been a couple months. How are you against a fire quirk?" Dabi asked as Deku started trying to fix Stain's forehead, mumbling apologies under his breath. Deku flinched just the tiniest bit and Dabi lifted an eyebrow. Did the kid have previous trauma from a fire quirk user? Unsurprising, although it was hard to imagine that this sunflower had a traumatic backstory. "It depends, I guess," the kid answered, not looking away from the gauze he was pressing to Stain's forehead. "I'm okay at deciphering weaknesses in opponents, but fire users are probably hard to beat because of the heat factor." My butt," Stain grumbled, clearly annoyed with Deku for some reason. The kid ignored him. "I don't think I could beat Endeavor," the kid said honestly. "If that's why you were asking." "Nah, I think it would take a FING miracle for anyone to beat that a-hole in a fight." Dabi lifted a hand, flicking blue fire out from his fingertips. "I was just trying to figure out the odds of me being able to beat you in a fight." The kid's eyebrows twitched together as Dabi let the flame slip away. "Right now the odds are high," he said, turning away to look at Stain's forehead again. "But if I made an effort, by the end of the week you wouldn't be able to beat me." Well, that was a bold statement. Dabi was surprised. He hadn't expected the kid to throw out a full-on challenge like that. "Why is that?" he asked. The kid didn't answer, just pursed his lips together. Stain answered for him. Because despite what his painfully low self-esteem tells him, Deku is an amazing quirk analyst. He'll find your weaknesses and poke them. He likes to deny it, but he's already found all of mine, and he uses them. It's crazy, actually. "I didn't do that," the green bean mumbled. Then tell me why you aimed for the back of my calf 2 days ago? The kid didn't answer for a long time, and Dobby was half convinced he wasn't ever going to answer, when he finally said, "You were limping." The proof. The kid sighed. Dobby snickered at his defeated expression. Endeavor have any weaknesses? He asked curiously. He honestly didn't think Endeavor did have any weaknesses, but it would be interesting to see what the underripe banana could come up with. He's reckless and too stubborn to stop fighting when he's injured, Deku said, lifting a shoulder. He's too prideful. All it would take is a few good insults and the guy would completely shut down. So you're saying if I walked up to the garbage fire and called him a dickhead, he'd suddenly be unable to beat me? Dobby asked incredulously. No, I'm saying if you were in a fight with him and made an actually intelligent attack on his character, he would stop fighting. Especially anything relating to his kids. Dobby felt his expression sour. His kids? Sure. It doesn't take a genius to know that there's something going on at home that Endeavor doesn't want everyone to know. All it takes to prove it is one look at his fourth kid. I can't remember his name, but he has a really bad burn scar over his eye. Shudo, Dobby supplied before he could think. Right? Sho. The kid gave him a curious look. Wow, you really pay attention to Endeavor, don't you? Well, that's enough of that, Stain interrupted, saving Dobby's butt. He'd bandaged his own forehead when Deku had been distracted. I obviously am in no condition to fight right now, so you two can spar instead. He settled down against the wall of the alley, crossing his arms and watching them carefully. Have fun. Quirks? Dobby asked, pushing off the wall and casually standing in the middle of the alley, facing the kid. Knives? The kid asked with a wary expression, settling into a deep, stable-looking stance. Neither. No advantages. The kid smirked and Dobby blinked in surprise. Why was it so weird whenever Broccoli Head smiled? My kind of fight, Deku said. Before Dobby even had any hope of reacting, the kid was across the alley, one arm raised to slam into his neck. Staggering back a few feet as Deku's forearm hit his chest, he reached for his quirk before remembering he wasn't supposed to use that. As he tried to regain his footing, the kid dropped down, one leg sweeping out as he fell into a crouch. It hit Dobby in the back of the knees and he fell flat on his back. Deku was on top of him in an instant, pinning his arms down with his knees. Dobby gave him a dazed look. What just happened? I beat you, Deku said cheerfully, scrambling to his feet and offering Dobby a hand up. I wasn't trying, Dobby protested, which was a half-truth. He hadn't expected the little bean sprout to actually know how to fight, and he'd been caught off guard by that goddamn smile. He wouldn't be making that mistake again. Let's do it again. Deku shrugged, backing down the alley again. Okay. They started again, Dobby making the first move this time. Deku was fast, and he was smart, and Stain was right about how good the kid was at finding weaknesses. A half a minute into the fight, he figured out that Dobby often left his midriff unprotected in favor of blocking his face, an old habit from training, and he brutally utilized that weakness until Dobby adjusted for it. It was a close call, but Dobby managed to win, barely, by playing really dirty and scooping some dirt up from the alley to throw in the kid's face. The kid was caught off guard for probably the first time this entire fight, and he was distracted long enough for Dobby to tackle him to the ground and pin him there, face down. Deku sighed into the street. You fight dirty. So do you, Dobby observed. Friends, Stain said, nodding. Both Dobby and Deku threw him a glare. I should go home, Deku said, wiggling around on his stomach to try to get out from under Dobby. Hopping casually to his feet, Dobby held out a hand and helped the kid up. I don't want to push my luck with my mom, and I've been out longer than usual. Dobby blinked in surprise. The kid had a home and a mom who would worry if he was gone. So much for the traumatic backstory. You know where to find me, Dobby said, bowing his way out of the alley dramatically. The kid grinned, and for the first time, it actually reached his eyes. Yeah, I'll find you and beat your butt. Dobby raised his eyebrows. Where'd you learn language like that? Deku just laughed and, smirking, Dobby turned around the corner. Screw Stain's weird friendship plans, but the kid was actually someone Dobby could see himself wanting to hang out with more. He wondered vaguely what Deku's quirk was. The UA entrance exam was coming up fast, and all Katsuki could think about was stupid Deku and his stupid quirkless butt. First, for months ago, the DMN nerd had the audacity to get in a fight with Katsuki and actually FING win. And then he did it again. And again. Deku had already broken his nose once, when he ran him into a wall, and he was starting to realize that somehow, the stupid fucker had learned to fight. That was troubling. For many reasons, of course, but the biggest one was that in order for him to be learning to fight, someone had to teach the weakling, and that meant someone had to find potential in him. And there wasn't any potential to find there. Katsuki had checked. So what did this mystery teacher see in shitty Deku that no one else had seen? What had Katsuki missed? Even worse, Deku had changed recently. He wasn't the same as he was 5 months ago, that was for sure. Before, he'd followed Katsuki around, chattering like an annoying bird or like a FING mewing cat. It was so annoying. But now, he ignored Katsuki, or avoided him at all costs. He didn't even seem to be imagining they were friends anymore, and while Katsuki wanted to feel grateful, instead all he felt was this weird but sense of loss. Everything felt off. And the other day Deku swore. In class. Straight up FING swore. Since when does the nerd know how to string together the words, motherfucking fuckbucket? And since when does he FING say that in class? In front of the teacher? Whoever this trainer was, they were teaching Deku a lot of things. Like how to disappear in the hallways, whether or not they were full of people. Or how to throw a really good punch. Or how to have an exceptionally dirty mouth, as the case may be. Deku was becoming actually competent, and Katsuki didn't like it. But it didn't matter now. He had to push the shitty nerd out of his mind. Because he needed to focus. The UA entrance exam was coming up in 5 months. He didn't have time to be distracted. Dabi must have liked Izuku because he went out of his way to find them the next day, and the day after that, and so on. Izuku figured it was more because Dabi liked Stain than because he liked some random green kid who happened to throw knives. Nobody really ever liked Izuku, or seemed to anyway, and he could understand why. He wasn't really anything special, and the one thing that made him unique wasn't something to brag about. Then again, Dabi never asked him about his quirk. It was weird, like he didn't even care what it was. At school, the first thing people would ask when they met was about the other person's quirk. It was the basis for all judgments, it was how people determined social hierarchy. So it was strange, to say the least, to be around people who didn't seem to care. And because Dabi didn't care, and Izuku didn't either, they found other reasons to like each other. Izuku liked Dabi because the guy was smart and had a painfully funny sense of humor. He never got upset when Izuku beat him at sparring, and he was flexible enough to shift fighting styles and throw Izuku off. He gave advice without prompting, rarely got angry or out of control, and was all around an easy person to be with. Also, as a rule, he never asked prying questions, and Izuku never felt pressured to share his life story, which was oddly relieving. Of course, Dabi wasn't without flaws. Probably the most unstable person Izuku had ever met. He often seemingly randomly would fly into a sky-high mood or sink into a sulky rage state. Neither option was good, and both of them usually meant Dabi would not listen to reason, and could go on a killing spree without warning. Also, Dabi wasn't great at discussions of morality or analysis or really anything Izuku wanted to philosophize about. Dabi tended to like ranting about Endeavor, discussing false heroes, ranting about Endeavor, listening to Izuku break apart his quirk for the 10th time, ranting about Endeavor, sharing villain community gossip of which he had a lot, or, shockingly, ranting about Endeavor. Izuku also learned very quickly to not ask Dabi about his past, as it was the surest way to send Dabi into a homicidal rage spiral. What Izuku didn't understand was what Dabi could possibly see in him that made him seem likable. Either Dabi was just as lonely and desperate for human contact as Izuku, or he just had very poor taste in people, because Izuku wasn't worth having as a friend. Or, of course, Dabi was just crazy, which was looking increasingly possible. Izuku suspected that there was a lot more to him than met the eye, but since Dabi seemed to be respecting his privacy, he decided to return the favor and not look into his past, as tempting as it might be. He had risked a Google search, but nothing came up. After that, It had taken a great deal of self-control to not hack into police records for people with fire quirks or hospital records for people with burn scars, but he managed. He was still managing. Every night, he would stare at his computer for ages, internally debating the pros and cons of finding out Dabi's history, and every night he would reluctantly tuck the computer away. So he settled on just believing that Dabi was crazy, and that was the only reason he seemed to like being around Izuku. Then again, there was always the possibility that Dabi genuinely liked Izuku, but the thought of that was so strange. Izuku was annoying and weak, and he muttered all the time and he was a waste of space. It was the idea that he could be friends with someone, let alone someone he just met, was so foreign to Izuku it felt impossible. So he settled for assuming the only reason Dabi stayed around was for Stain. It was easier that way. But Izuku liked Dabi, and he was learning quite a lot from him. Sometime after they began sparring, Dabi started teaching him other tools of the villain trade. Some of these were more relevant than others. Izuku didn't think he'd ever need to know how to shoplift to be a hero. But then again, after a few lessons in how to rob a store, Izuku got really good at catching other people robbing stores. He knew what to look for. But learning to shoplift itself wasn't helpful and was very illegal, so whenever they had that type of lesson he always found himself sneaking back into the store to purchase the items the legal way. Then there were the more relevant things, like how to get people to give information for free. Izuku liked learning that type of stuff because it was all about analysis and prediction, figuring out how his own actions would affect his audience. There was a certain subtlety to it that he appreciated, like he was changing people's minds and they didn't even know. He preferred not to think of it as manipulation, but that's what it was, really. It required strategy, a lot of split-second decisions, and an in-depth analysis of the audience's brain. And then all he had to do was change his attitude or language, and people would come falling down. It's scary when you do that, Dabi told Izuku once, when they'd split off from Stain so Dabi could use Izuku to get some information about an up-and-coming villain group he wanted to watch. Izuku had gotten the information from their broker easily enough, although it had taken a complete personality change. He'd had to pretend to be cold, aloof, and untouchable. It was one of his favorite masks, actually, and it was stunningly effective. He gave Dabi a curious look. What's scary? The way you look like a completely different person. And how easy it is for you to SWs between personas like that. Izuku laughed, brushing that off. It wasn't hard to do. Dabi was just being silly. If he wanted to put on a different mask, he could do it too. It was just acting and adjusting to the environment. Dabi stopped in the alley, catching Izuku's arm. Insistent, he said, "No, Deku, I'm serious. It's scary how easily you can get people to do what you want. Cool, but terrifying." Faltering a little, Izuku frowned. I'm not making them do it, I'm just. It's not a bad thing." Dabi laughed. "It's incredible. You'd make an amazing leader, kid. People would follow you wherever you went. You could be unstoppable." Izuku's frown deepened as they started walking again. Unstoppable? But that would mean he had power, and he definitely didn't. He didn't even have a quirk, he was just weak and useless as always. But maybe there was a certain power that came from being useless. Maybe being useless gave him some other type of power, the ability to move people. He shook his head, jostling himself out of that thought process while he still could. He didn't need false hope right now. "Which hero school are you applying to?" Dabi asked, eyebrows raised. He'd been trying to get Izuku to answer that question for at least a month, springing the question at the oddest of times, but Izuku never answered. It was none of Dabi's business, and anyway, people always made fun of him when they found out. "What's a hero school?" he asked, blinking innocently at him. "Little sheet," Dabi grumbled. Oh yeah, and Dabi had the biggest vocabulary of swear words Izuku had ever borne witness to. They were creative too. He treated swearing like it was an art form. And now some of those curse words were creeping into Izuku's speech too. His mother was not impressed. Neither, to everyone's surprise, was Bakugo Katsuki. It was around this time that Izuku started to get obsessed with underground heroics. Before, he'd always loved the flashy heroes, the ones that got the attention of the spotlight and were always smiling no matter the situation. But then he'd met All Might and realized most of that was fake. Being around Stain for so long meant that some of his ideology was rubbing off on Izuku, and he was honestly really starting to understand all of Stain's ranting about false heroes. He couldn't agree fully because saving people is still saving people whether or not it's for the glory, and killing heroes because they spend some time every day smiling for the cameras is stupid, and oftentimes spotlight heroes were symbols of hope for the population. But he could agree, in part, that if spotlight heroes spent less time worrying about how they were perceived and more time saving people, the world would be a safer place. Underground heroes and vigilantes were great because they did just that. They saved people regardless of how it would make them look, and they worked hard to make sure everyone was safe, usually without any credit. Izuku loved the idea of saving someone and not having to have all the attention afterwards. He wanted to be able to save people without them knowing it was him doing it. Then again, he liked thinking about public image and smiling under pressure, but to be a hero, all he needed was to want to save people, which he did. So technically, as Stain continually reminded him, being a vigilante was a great backup option if he couldn't get into UA. And so, life went on. Stain yelled at Izuku a few times for low self-esteem, which Izuku promised he didn't have. It's not low self-esteem if he really was more worthless than everyone else. Then it's just harsh reality. Surprisingly, Stain was not impressed with that logic. Izuku didn't think Stain had any room for finger-pointing anyway. The hero killer wasn't exactly the perfect picture of emotional maturity. There were days when he'd rant about his ideology for hours until Izuku had to go home. There were days when he stopped to help people carry their groceries. There were days when he was a homicidal asshat. Both of them had good days and bad days, and Stain had no right to judge Izuku for something so inconsequential as low self-esteem. It was so stupid. Izuku was too worthless to waste people's time with his self-esteem issues. That was a big part of the reason Izuku wanted so badly to be a hero. He'd been useless his whole life. He'd had to sit there, helpless, while heroes fought villains in front of him. They were all so powerful, it was like they were unbeatable. It wasn't that other professions weren't useful, just that heroes were so clearly amazing that the other options seemed non-existent. Soon enough, Izuku had become convinced the only way he could turn his Dekunubu into a Dikairu would be to become a hero. He wasn't so sure about that anymore. Dabi and Stain seemed to think he would be pretty useful as a vil. Izuku never let himself finish that thought. He always managed to cut himself off before he completed the final word. But he had to wonder, would he be more useful in a world where no one accepted him or in a world where everyone had to? Dabi decided he liked Deku. There was no way to describe him, actually. He was smart and fast and really painfully good at beating Dabi in fights. A while ago, he'd to start using his quirk in order to beat the kid. He was just really good at hand-to-hand combat. Of course, that was expected, with Stain as his teacher. But now the little sheet was starting to figure out how to beat Dabi even with his quirk, which was annoying. Especially since his strategy generally included a lot of insults and dirty shots. Today, Dabi had decided he didn't want to have his character attacked while getting kicked behind the knees, so he was sitting in the bar, playing on his phone and flicking his eyes around the room as he watched people come and go. He liked the bar because here he had access to information flow, and it was incredibly easy to find people with grudges against Endeavor. It was networking. Plus, he was well known here, and people often liked to give him favors for favors. Which meant he could sit here and people would hire him to do their dirty work. Dabi's phone rang and he sighed, lifting it to his ear as he saw the caller ID. Stain, I told you I'm not. Dabi! Deku's panicked voice came across the line. He sounded very distraught. Dabi, oh my god, stop, Stain, you're freaking me out. Stain, stop doing that. Kid, what the F happened? Okay, so Stain and I were sparring and I had my katana and then he tried to grab my arm but then I did something he taught me the other day but I didn't realize that it was going to do that. Stop looking at me like that, Stain. I really didn't. What did you do? Dabi said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady, a polar opposite to Deku's voice, which was an octave higher than usual. I cut open his arm. Deku screamed into the phone, so loud that Dabi had to move the phone away from his ear, and several of the people sitting around him looked over in curiosity. And blood is like oozing out of it? And I can see the bone and he's bleeding everywhere and I don't know what to do. I've been trying to apply pressure and I found some gauze, but Dobby, please help, please, I don't know what to do. He told me I couldn't take him to the hospital, but his arm is. Kid, take a deep breath, just breathe for a second. You don't need to go to the hospital. Dobby stood up on his chair, looking the bar up and down as he searched for someone who came in almost every day to drown her miseries in alcohol. There are a lot of people with healing quirks that don't exactly follow all the rules. He caught sight of her bright purple hair across the bar and dropped to the ground, carefully making his way around tables as he moved to her. Send me your location, and I'll bring the morally ambiguous doctor over. Good. Deku hiccuped. I'm going to keep trying to stop the bleeding. I think I hit an artery or something. Good idea. I'm gonna hang up now, okay? Just hang in there until I get to you, okay? Neech, Deku said, sounding like that was the only response he could manage at the moment. Dobby hung up and sighed heavily, sliding into the booth across from the morally ambiguous doctor. He didn't usually call her, unless he burned himself beyond repair, which happened more often than he'd like to admit. She almost never requested to be paid, and if she did, it was only in favors, so he didn't mind doing transactions with her, not like he did with other people who wanted payment in cash. He wasn't exactly fluid. Her name was Fujimoto Reiki, but she hated it when people called her by her last name, so everyone called her Reiki or just the morally ambiguous doctor. Her quirk was one of the most useful ones in the underground, and people tended to flock from all over to talk to her. Because of that, she was one of the most organized people Dobby had ever met. If someone met her even once, she'd remember every detail she'd learned about them, so that if they needed her again, she would be able to help without the typical required questions. Dobby owed her too much to count at this point, but she didn't usually take payment. She did everything for free. It was probably the only thing keeping her from getting kidnapped, honestly, but Dobby was sure she had other reasons for it. The entire underground was indebted to Fujimoto Reiki. She gave him a bored look with her sharp gray eyes as he slid into a seat across the table from her. What do you want? I'm calling in a favor from Stain, he said, resting his elbows on the table and leaning into them. Reiki lifted an eyebrow. Yeah. Yep. His stupid kid just sliced open his arm. Thinks he hit an artery. If he hit an artery, Stain would probably be dead by now, Reiki said with apparent disinterest, although everyone who knew Reiki knew that she did genuinely care under the mask of impartiality. Well, then maybe he didn't. But the kid's freaking out, and apparently there's a lot of blood. Got a location? I'll take you. She sighed, downing the rest of her drink in one go as she stood. All right, I'm coming. You owe me, like, a lot, by the way. As always. He slipped out the window, Reiki right behind him, and led her down the deserted streets, following the address on his phone. A message came from Stain, aka Deku. Blood Eater, there's so much blood. He sighed, opening his messaging app. Cremation Reali burns, don't lick it. Blood Eater, why on earth would I lick it? In all honesty, Izuku was freaking out. He didn't mean to cut Stain's arm. Stain usually dodged away from Izuku's katana, and this time he was too slow. Which was actually kind of scary. And yeah, maybe the actual severed artery part of it could have been avoided if Izuku hadn't put so much pressure on the slice, but he wasn't used to actually cutting someone, so how was he supposed to know how much force to use? And anyway, Stain was the one who refused to let them practice with dull weapons because the weight distribution wasn't right, so this was arguably Stain's fault too. But mostly what happened was Izuku had panicked when Stain grabbed his wrist, phantom burning pains spreading up his arm. So he lashed out at Stain's arm without thinking, which was inexcusable, and he was already planning a very apologetic farewell speech for when Stain kicked him out. But right now, Stain was grinning at him like a maniac while Izuku pressed gauze into his wound in an attempt to stem the bleeding. Your first severed artery, he cooed, voice slurring. Isn't this exciting? No. Izuku screeched, seizing another piece of gauze and adding it to the blood-soaked pile of gauze he already had on Stain's arm. No, it's not. This is really bad. Why? Because I cut open your arm? Izuku didn't know why he was arguing with someone who was going into shock, but Stain was forcing the conversation. The window opened and Dabi ducked in, hands tucked casually in his pockets as his eyes swept the room and landed on Stain. "Huh," he said, eyeing the blood-stained gauze on Stain's arm. "Nice one, kid." "Not you too," Izuku groaned, pressing his fingers more aggressively against the wound. "Well, this is new," a new, unfamiliar voice said dryly. Without lifting the pressure on Stain's arm, Izuku peered carefully around Dabi. A girl with a long bright purple ponytail was coming in from the window. She looked reasonably young, maybe around 25, with a short and slender figure. Her gray eyes were focused on Stain, and she looked almost amused, a playful smile dancing around her thin lips. Underneath that, though, Izuku could see clear worry as she crossed the room to them. She was hiding it under a smile. It felt familiar, painfully similar to All Might. Stendhal the hero killer, bleeding out. She flashed a grin at Izuku as she knelt next to him in the puddle of blood next to Stain. "Color me impressed." Hi, he stuttered in his panic. "Are you a doctor?" "Yes." The doctor nudged Izuku aside so she could lift Stain's arm and look it over. She gently pulled the gauze away, barely even blinking when blood started gushing out of it again. "Well, it's going to be fine," the doctor said as she looked at the cut carefully, "because my quirk is a beach." Stain turned his head away and threw up. The doctor didn't even glance over at him. She was so focused on the arm. "Don't worry, Deku. You hit a vein, not an artery, so he probably hasn't lost too much blood yet. This'll be easy to fix." She reached out 2 fingers toward him. "Ready?" "For what?" he asked, shifting a few more inches away so he was kneeling closer to Stain's head. "The healing, of course," the doctor answered, rolling her eyes and reaching out 2 fingers. She lightly pressed them to Izuku's left arm and held her other blood-stained hand out over Stain's body. Her hands started to glow purple, like her hair, and she closed her eyes, focusing. Izuku watched with some horror as Stain's skin started to slowly mesh itself together, like a zipper. A moment later, it was done, nothing left but a long scar. "You know the deal, Stain," the doctor said, purple fading from her hands as she dropped his arm. "No use of that arm for a full day, and I would recommend lots of rest for both of you for a couple days." To Izuku, she added, "He lost a lot of blood, so he's going to need a lot of rest. Make sure he gets it." Izuku stared at Stain's healed arm. "That is the coolest quirk I have ever seen." "Oh, you like it?" She didn't look all too excited, but she kindly explained her quirk to Izuku, who was eagerly bouncing up and down in place. "I call it Stitch, and basically it stitches pieces of the body back together. It's effective against cuts, bruises, punctures, detached limbs, severed arteries, set broken bones, you name it. And it allows me to do skin grafts with willing donors, which is the only reason Patchwork over there is still alive." Dabi rolled his eyes, and the doctor smirked a little. "I also have some really sharp teeth, so if someone has a bad burn or something I can rip off that part of their skin and then stitch the healthy parts back together. Pretty neat." She bared her spiky teeth at Izuku to demonstrate. "Wow. And why did you need me?" "It uses other people's life force. I can technically use mine too, but I don't particularly like being exhausted, so it's better if there's someone else in the room." "Wow." Izuku opened his mouth to keep firing questions and analyze the quirk further, but Dabi cleared his throat very loudly from behind him, and he caught himself before starting a mutter storm. "Deku, this is Fujimoto Reiki," Dabi said, apparently realizing they hadn't been introduced yet, "but don't call her Fujimoto or she'll rip out your still-beating heart and eat it." Reiki didn't look all that fazed by Dabi's description of her reaction to people calling her by her surname, so Izuku decided it was probably a good idea to just stick with calling her Reiki instead. "People just call me the morally ambiguous doctor," Reiki said, standing up and frowning at the blood staining the knees of her breathes. "Well, Stendhal, it would appear you've met your match." Somewhere in the last minute, Stain had gained some semblance of sanity and was looking over his arm carefully. His words came out slurred, but at least they made logical sense now as he replied, "Yeah, we're not going to be doing any more sparring with each other. Last week he put a deep cut in my leg, and the week before that he almost broke my thumb. I'm sorry, Izuku shrieked, moving to bury his face in his hands. A moment before they made contact with his face, he froze, staring at the blood all over them. He wasn't sure he liked actually cutting people, now that he'd done it to Stain a few times. It was so messy. There were other ways to fight, right? Ways that didn't require beating people up? Well, with the way society was run, Izuku wasn't so sure. Yeah, don't touch your face, Reiki advised, smirking. Your mommy wouldn't want to see you with bloody handprints all over your cheeks, Dabi said in a mocking tone. Izuku turned to him and solemnly flipped him off. Dabi choked on empty air as he started to laugh. Reiki crossed the room and slapped him on the back with a bloody hand as she crossed to the window. He spluttered indignantly. Wait, Izuku started, watching her leaving. She paused halfway out the window and looked back at him. What he wanted was another friend. Now that he had experience with having friends, he wanted as many as he could get, and he definitely wasn't going to get any in school. It was so nice having people that actually cared about his well-being. And Reiki was so amazing. She had such a cool quirk. Someone with a quirk like that must be really great to have as a friend. He hesitated as she waited for him to finish. If you're worried about the aftereffects of my quirk, she said, eyebrows twisting up with something bordering compassion or concern, I can look up your medical records from the hospital and… No, he gasped, shaking his head. He didn't want her looking at his records, because if she saw his records she'd also see he was quirkless, and that wasn't exactly information he wanted floating around. No, I was… Oh, for F's sake, Deku, Dabi said, with a heavy sigh. Repeat after me, you seem nice and I would like to have your contact details. Izuku blushed bright red as Stain laughed weakly behind him. The words fell out of his mouth all in a rush. You seem nice and I would like to have your contact details so we can maybe stay in touch and maybe be friends, but I totally get it if you don't want to because I know you don't know me and I'm annoying and… For the last time, Stain growled, you aren't annoying. Izuku tipped his head to the side. But I am… No, you are not. I don't think you're annoying, Reiki said pointedly, coming back inside from the window while fishing her phone out of her pocket. And sure, we can stay in touch. I don't really have any friends either, and Dabi needs healing like every other week. Dabi flipped her off with both hands, so I'll stick around until he decides it's time to care about personal safety. Have Discord? Yes. Alrighty then. They exchanged contact details and Reiki promised to come back the next day to check up on Stain. Then she left, explaining that Stain, unfortunately, wasn't the only person to get hurt in the dark hours of night, and she had other people to help. So now Izuku had another new friend, courtesy of training with Stain. And they were going to need to find a new way for him to continue that training, because he was now almost equal to Stain's skill. Izuku didn't really like the solution his mentor came up with. Stain watched Deku carefully as the kid balanced on the rail of a fire escape, surveying the alley below them with a bewildered gaze. He was in a green hoodie and dark gray breathes with his typical red shoes on his feet. A black medical mask hid his face, 2 katanas were slung over his back, several knives were in holsters around his thighs, arms, and hips, and he was carefully holding his bow next to him in one hand. After a moment, the kid's eyes lifted and met Stain's, puzzled expression overwhelming the rest of his features. What are we doing here? He whispered. We're going to be vigilantes tonight, Stain announced, grinning as Deku's face contorted in panic and stress. What? He yelled, clearly freaking out. Why? Because, Deku, if you recall, 2 days ago you cut open a vein in my arm, Stain responded dryly. The kid's freckled cheeks flushed and he returned his gaze to the ground as Stain continued. So we need some new people for you to gain battle experience with, and why not use real villains? Don't worry, we'll start slow. Now, as for what we're doing here specifically, he tipped his head to the side. This is one of the worst areas of town, so crime rates are high. Heroes rarely patrol this area at night because they don't see the point in it, since there aren't any cameras. The only hero we'd maybe have to worry about running into would be Eraserhead, but I've memorized his patrol schedules and I'll help you steer clear of him. Now let's find a mugging. Deku released a heavy sigh and hopped from the fire escape to the roof of the next building over, landing perfectly. Stain stifled a laugh. The kid was such a fast learner. He definitely wasn't an expert, and he certainly wasn't at Stain's level of skill yet, but he was learning much more quickly than Stain would expect from anyone. Being able to land a hit on Stain, and doing it multiple times, no less, was no feat to laugh at, and the speed at which Deku had progressed to that point was unbelievable. It suddenly crossed Stain's mind that one day, probably soon, Deku would become better than Stain, and an invisible shudder ran through his body. He'd need to make sure to stay on the kid's good side, then. He jumped after the kid, landing easily into a run for the next roof. "Keep your ear out for trouble," he called as he ran, Deku begrudgingly keeping up. "Eventually you'll be able to hear what a crime in progress sounds like, but for now, just listen out for everything you think sounds suspicious." Deku rolled his eyes as he sprinted in preparation for another jump. "I'm not going to be a vigilante, Stain," he muttered, quietly enough that Stain almost didn't catch it. "Okay," he responded, not believing him for a second. It was hard to come back from the thrill of being a vigilante. Something had to be said for the feeling of saving people and running from the law at the same time, like a never-ending, very stressful joy ride. It came with a certain kind of freedom that being a villain or a hero just didn't have. The freedom to choose exactly what to do with the power one had, instead of following with whatever society wanted. The freedom to choose who to save and who to fight. Plus it was good exercise. There was the distant sound of a scream. Deku stumbled a little, head already turned in the direction of the sound. Stain slapped him on the back as he ran past. "No hesitations," he barked, jumping down into the alley, "or people will die." "No hesitations," he heard Deku repeat, sprinting alongside him from the top of the building. They ran like that for a while before Deku finally dropped down to join him in the streets. After a few more blocks, Stain glanced down an alley and froze, shooting his arm out to stop Deku from turning the corner. "They're down there," he murmured, keeping his voice as low as possible so the three people down the alley and the person they were probably raping or at least mugging wouldn't hear him. Deku nodded, taking a moment to catch his breath and hold it before poking his head around the wall to look. "Oh, if dash," he breathed. Stain flicked his shoulder. "Language." "Oh, sheet," Deku corrected. Stain sighed. What had he been thinking when he'd decided to introduce the kid to Dobby? That was a terrible idea. "So what's your plan?" he asked casually, leaning back against the wall. "Run and get a hero," Deku said immediately, looking around as though expecting one to just be standing there. Flicking his shoulder again, Stain shook his head. "Remember what I said? No heroes patrol here at night except Eraserhead, and he's not over here." Deku kneaded his forehead, scowling. "Okay, so," he stuck his head around the corner again. Quirks look to be, some sort of size quirk? It doesn't look like he has much range, so it's not going to be very useful in a fight. A porcupine quirk, avoid the spikes, and that person doesn't have any visible quirk effects, so I'm not sure about them. "Okay, I can do this." He climbed up the wall next to them and Stain followed shortly after, tailing him as the kid ran lightly along the top edge of the building. Deku suddenly turned and dived headfirst off the building, landing directly onto Size Quirk's shoulders and effectively flattening him to the ground. Immediately he turned and slammed a fist into Porcupine's solar plexus and then whirled around to execute a perfect tornado kick into Unknown's shoulder. In an instant his bow was extended, held easily out to attack. Before he could do any real damage, both Unknown and Porcupine fled from the alley. Size Quirk was out cold. Deku dropped his hands to his side, loosely holding his bow in one, and looking almost disappointed. "They ran away," he said, sounding almost hurt as Stain started dropping down into the alley. "That does happen a lot," Stain admitted. "It means they think you're too big a threat to fight." Looking a half-second away from falling into a full-on pout, Deku turned to look at the fourth person present, the victim. "Are you okay?" he asked, suddenly looking very concerned. Stain grabbed the back of his shirt before the person could answer and dragged him, protesting, out of the alley. "We don't ask that," he explained shortly. "We don't stick around to ask questions. We stop the crime and we leave." Deku twisted under his arm, forcing him to let go. "You might not," but this is my Vigilante academia, and I want to make sure people are okay. He ran back into the alley. Sighing, Stain waited at the entrance of the alley while Deku helped the victim and encouraged her to call the police while he started fixing up her injuries. Stain turned and pressed his forehead against the wall. Deku's big heart was going to get him killed. Vigilantes don't hang around the scene of a crime because when they do, police sirens in the distance. Damn it. Kid, we've gotta go, he yelled, sprinting down the alley. Deku finished tying off some gauze around the girl's arm and jumped for the fire escape, following Stain without question for once. Maybe because he could hear the sirens too. They ran over the rooftops as quickly as they could, until Deku stopped abruptly, head turned toward a clattering noise to their right. Crime, he suggested, changing directions and heading for it. It wasn't a crime, Stain knew it wasn't, because there was a difference between the noise of a cat knocking over a can in an alley and a person getting thrown into a dumpster. But this was Deku's Vigilante academia, so he followed him down to the alley where, sure enough, an innocuous cat was sitting, liking its paws over a bunch of fallen cans. Deku wilted as Stain laughed at him. Okay. I'm not any good at this, he said, glaring. I get it. With an annoyed huff, he jumped for the roofs again and ran off. After Vigilante training with Stain, which was surprisingly fun but very illegal, Izuku briefly considered going home, before changing directions and going straight to the bar where he'd met Dabi. He'd been here a few times since then, but always with supervision, so this was his first time going in alone. But he wanted to talk to the morally ambiguous doctor, because he figured she'd have answers to his morally ambiguous questions. So, tired body protesting, he pulled himself through the window and slipped in. He'd discovered there was an art to not being noticed in here, and he'd somehow gotten very good at it. Only a few people looked up as he padded through the room, and they all lost interest quickly. Spotting Raiki's purple hair across the room, he slid into the chair across from her and set his elbows on the table. She raised an eyebrow. I have a question, he said. She blinked, eyebrows still raised. Izuku took that as a cue to continue. Hypothetically speaking, if there was a person in a position of power who, helped a lot of people for their job but outside of their job was as morally corrupt as they get, is it better to destroy their lives or leave them alone? Raiki's eyebrow dropped and her nose wrinkled up a little. Ugh, philosophy late at night, just what I always wanted. She sighed. Let's go to the roof, Kay? She climbed out of her chair, giving a tired wave to the bartender as she passed on her way to the window. Once there, she climbed up the fire escape and jumped to the roof, Izuku following much more gracefully behind her. So you're asking what I would do between those two things? Raiki asked once he'd gotten up, sounding almost puzzled as she crossed the roof, stopping just in front of the railing around the perimeter. Izuku nodded, tailing her over there. Yes. Raiki scoffed a little. Oh, I would burn that beach. Villains don't deserve to hide behind reputation. If you're going to be a villain, you gotta admit to it. It's like a code. Eyebrows twitching together a bit, Izuku repeated, a code. Well, not like, officially, she amended, leaning against the railing and looking out over the city. But like, it's, in the villain community, villains like to know who other villains are. So people who pretend to be good, no one likes someone like that. Especially if they're selling out other villains. Look, it's like, she huffed a little, turning around and leaning backwards against the railing so she could look up at the sky. It's like, if you're going to be a villain, you have to own it. Hiding just isn't cool. Unless you're a spy hired by someone, then that's different. But yeah, like if a big-name CEO was secretly like, I don't know, doing quirk trafficking or some shit, then yeah, that guy deserves to die. Izuku blinked. Death seemed harsh. Figuratively, she added, winking at him as she caught his discomfort. He breathed out a relieved laugh. So do you, he frowned, pressing his hands into the railing as he thought through his question. Do you think of yourself as a villain? Oh, sure, she said dismissively. I mean, I help villains succeed, which is pretty much the same thing by society's definition. I think it's possible to be a villain and a hero at the same time. I mean, I'm still saving people and usually greatly improving their quality of life. It's just that I'm helping the people society has chosen to hate. That's what makes me a villain. Izuku tipped his head to the side, looking at her thoughtfully. That doesn't seem to bother you. The corners of her eyes crinkled up as she laughed in the most genuine way Izuku had yet to see. Why would it? She asked, grinning. The word villain is just that, a word. It's a label and yeah, it applies to me. I'm fine that, with who I am I've sacrificed everything I have to save everyone I can. I think that's something to be proud of, you know? Like, yeah, maybe it's not what everyone wants from me, so what? I'm doing what makes me happy. And I don't get to do that in real society, so it's sort of like a big F you to everyone who's expected me to be someone I'm not. Wait, something about that didn't sit right with Izuku. He thought back through her words, trying to figure out what it was that bothered him. After a moment, it hit him. You said people want you to be doing something. Else? What else would they want you to be doing? Your quirk is perfect for this. Her smile dropped away and she sighed, eyes dropping to her shoes. Yeah, my quirk is perfect. It's a little too perfect actually. My day job is, I'm a hero healer. Izuku's eyes widened. Wow, that's so cool. Hero healers are some of the coolest heroes because they care for the people that care for everyone else. Your quirk is so perfect for being a hero healer, although I wonder if you have to have self-defense lessons too because your quirk is... He trailed off in his mutterstorm because Reiki had a sad look in her eye as she watched him begin enthusing about her quirk. A silence fell between them, Izuku watching Reiki curiously and Reiki looking pensively at the building in front of her. Everyone always says it's such a good quirk, she said quietly. But I didn't go to medical school so I could help heroes. Actually, I've always wanted to be a lawyer. Social justice is just the most interesting subject, I think, and I want to make a difference in the world. I want there to be social change, and I want people to be able to be treated equally, no matter what they look like or what their quirks are. I went to medical school because from the time my quirk manifested on, everyone's been looking at me. Everyone wants me to be a healer. When I would talk to people about my passions, they'd look at me weirdly because it didn't match my quirk. They would say I was an awful person for wasting such a good quirk. They'd tell me I was selfish for wanting to make a difference without using my healer quirk. So I went to medical school and I became a doctor. I've never had any control over my life, really. I never get to choose who I treat or who I get to save. And I don't want to heal heroes. She gave Izuku a sharp look when he made a quizzical sound. How could anyone not want to heal heroes? A lot of them were so amazing. Heroes can afford the best healers in the world, she explained, voice hard and cold. They have so much money, and they can throw it around wherever they want to. They don't need my quirk, not when there are hundreds of healers available. Her expression shifted into a full-on glare, and she pushed off the railing, walking a few steps across the roof, hands clenched up. There are people out there who don't have access to healers. She whipped around, a fire in her eye. There are people out there who can't afford it. And who am I to heal people for millions of dollars, when it's something as easy for me as just sitting still? I am here because I want to save people. Her voice was firm and steady, and Izuku got the impression that she was determined about this, that she had conviction. I'm here because I want to save people who can't be saved. Heroes get saved every day and they're such egotistical asshats that they don't even realize it. They don't see how lucky they are. There are people out there who don't get to be saved because no one looks twice at them. Do you know the assault rates on quirkless people, Deku? Do you know how many quirkless people die in the hospital because no one would treat them and they didn't have jobs to pay for it anyway? A shiver ran down Izuku's spine. He did know. He knew so well. I don't want people to die, Deku, Reiki said firmly. I want people to live and live and live until they're sick of it. Heroes aren't the only people that matter. She waved her arms around, demonstrating everything around them. There is so much in this world besides heroes, and people don't notice it because they're so busy looking up that they forget to look around. Look around, Deku. Everyone deserves to be saved. So I'll save them. No matter what my stupid handlers have to say about it. Evidently done with her speech, she returned back to the railing with an annoyed huff. They fell back into silence. So that was why Reiki did what she did. She wanted to save the people that no one else would save, that no healer would even look at or touch. And she did it for as little as possible. From what Stain had told him, Izuku knew that Dabi had gone to Reiki countless times to get his burns fixed up. And Izuku also knew that Dabi absolutely would not have been able to afford that if he'd gone to a normal hospital. Reiki probably charged something, but it wouldn't be an exorbitant amount, and Izuku got the distinct impression that if she found someone who couldn't pay, she wouldn't mind healing them anyway. Reiki healed people who couldn't get healing from others. People like Izuku, who no one wanted to help. Somehow, there was something heroic in that. Even if it meant she ignored all laws and was, technically, a villain. But in Izuku's mind, she was much more of a hero than a villain. She was, in all truth, a morally ambiguous doctor. He said eventually, breaking the silence. I understand what you said, and I think I agree. He shook his head. But I need to think about what this means for me. He cast a glance over at her, making a split-second decision to let her in on what was quickly becoming the biggest secret of his underground existence. My real name is Midoriya Izuku. Don't tell anyone. But when you get a chance, you can. You should go find my medical records, because there's stuff in there you should probably know that I don't really want to explain. More like, he didn't want to see her facial expression when she found out. Okay. She nodded, a faint smile tracing her lips. Midoriya Izuku. Sure thing, kid. He gave her a stiff nod and then climbed over the railing and started home. He did need to get some sleep, after all. And he had a lot to think about. Izuku was sore. Training with Stain naturally usually left his entire body exhausted, but this was different. He was really sore. Being a vigilante apparently took every muscle in his body and pushed them all past the breaking point because wow. His whole body complained every time he so much as twitched. He was lucky it was a weekend. As it was, Stain had been right about how much Izuku would love being a vigilante. There was a certain amount of excitement that came with saving people who wouldn't otherwise be saved. And also, as much as he hated to admit it, there was a certain thrill he got from going against what the heroes and the police wanted, hell, from what the world wanted, since everyone had told Izuku he couldn't do it. If they didn't want him saving people, though, then they needed to step up their game. Because he'd insert himself into the areas they'd missed, and he'd save those people for them. He'd be like Reiki, saving people who no one else wanted to. A distant knock hit the front door and Izuku sighed. Probably a door-to-door salesman or something. Who else would come over? Not Kaken, that was for sure. The sound of a female voice drifted down the hallway, but it was too quiet for Izuku to put any effort into figuring out who it was, and anyway, the chances of him knowing who it was were very slim. The door closed and he sighed, trying not to move as he frowned at his open UA application. He needed to input his quirk information and he was trying to figure out how to do it. How could he euphemize, I don't have a quirk? A knock came at his door and he turned slightly, frowning. He called tiredly. Anything else would be too much of an effort. His mother opened the door, looking a little confused by something, but also very pleased. Honey, your friend's here to see you. Izuku felt even more confused than his mom looked at this point. Who? The door opened a little bit more and he caught sight of a flash of purple hair. He was out of his chair in an instant, immediately regretting the decision to stand as his body protested angrily. Reiki, he gasped, falling back into the chair and clutching at his abs. Wow, Stendhal did a number on you, she laughed, brushing past his mom and stepping over to him. Oh. Izuku winced. Yeah. She put a hand over his stomach and let it glow purple. A moment later, Izuku felt much better. What did you do? He asked, kneading his fingers over his shoulders, which had been very sore a moment ago. Stitched your muscles back together, she said with a shrug. I'll leave you two alone, Izuku's mom said, backing out of the room with a small smile and gently shutting the door. Reiki turned to Izuku with a very serious look. Midoriya Izuku, age 14, diagnosed as quirkless at age 4, she recited. Eyes filled with compassion, she finished in a soft voice, and yet still wants to be a hero. He pursed his lips together in response. How would you like to be recommended to the UA Hero course? She suggested, sitting on his bed and facing him. His jaw dropped. Seriously? She shrugged. Sure. Or I can change your medical records to look like you have a weak quirk if you want. Your chances of getting a job will go up by at least 30%. Seriously? Yeah. UA recommendation exam? He repeated, feeling lightheaded suddenly. You'd really do that? Of course, she said with a grin. Do you know how goddamn cool it would be to have a quirkless hero? I mean, come on. Think of all the stuff you could do. All the people you could save. The inspiration you would be to people who are used to getting beaten down because they have a weak quirk. You would be the best hero ever, no joke. Izuku wanted to cry. The words he'd wanted to hear his entire life, the words no one would ever tell him for fear of him getting hurt or killed, and now he was hearing them, from a villain. This world was twisted as F-. You would recommend me, for the recommendation exam? He repeated one more time, still trying to wrap his mind around the suggestion. Getting into UA through recommendations was hard, sure, but the odds of someone getting in through recommendations were much higher than those who took the general exam, especially for people who had non-combative quirks. Izuku had the experience and skill to get a reasonably good score on the UA general exam, but his odds on actually getting into the school were still very low. If he got recommended to UA, that entire story would change. He would be presented to a panel of judges and he would be able to show them exactly why he could be a hero. All that would be needed after that would be for them to not judge him because he was quirkless. But surely that wouldn't be a problem when they saw what he could do. Please recommend me, he said, eyes wide with excitement. You don't need to do anything to my records, just, please, recommend me to the UA exam. She smiled. Sure thing, kid. Tsukachi frowned at the woman sitting across from him at his desk. There was a rather large stack of paperwork from last night, and she was one of many who had come into the station to help fill out that paperwork. It could either be a good sign or a bad sign. Either some new underground heroes were taking interest in the area, or they had a vigilante. The second option was the most likely, but not optimal, especially since Tsukachi was still dealing with the aftermath of the recent hero killer activity nearby. Why don't you tell me what happened? He suggested, glancing over the report she'd helped fill out. Sure, she said, looking anxious in her chair, with her hands clasped nervously in her lap. I was cornered by 3 men last night. They attacked me in an alley and told me to give them money, but I didn't have anything on me because I don't usually carry money on me since when I have money with me, I use it. I told them I didn't have anything, but they didn't believe me. One of them cut my arm with a knife and I screamed. They stole my purse, but I didn't have anything in it except my phone. When they realized it was empty, they said I'd have to pay them, in other ways. A faint blush started on her cheeks and her eyes dropped down to her hands. They started, she bit her lip, tears coming to her eyes. You don't have to give all the details, Tsukachi said kindly. I have that part on file. What happened next? She nodded, meeting his eyes again. It was getting really bad and, uncomfortable when this kid dropped down from the roof and started fighting them. He knocked the first one out immediately, and then started fighting the second 2 right after, but they ran away before he could really do anything to them. I saw their faces though, she added hastily, so I worked with a sketch artist yesterday to help you find the 2 that ran. That's fine, keep going. Okay. So then another man dropped down from the roof after the kid and told him that they ran because they thought he was a threat, which made the kid look a little more relaxed or something. He'd seemed, kind of disappointed before that. So then the kid asked me if I was okay, but the other man started dragging him away. They left, but then a few seconds later, the kid came back and told me to call the police. He asked if I was okay and I told him about the cut on my arm, so he asked if he could do first aid on it, and I told him that was fine, so he pressed some gauze on it. He didn't really say anything else, just worked on my arm until we heard police sirens and the other man came back and told him they had to go. And then he just disappeared. I think maybe he went to the roof? Sorry, I don't know where he went. Tsukachi looked over the notes he had from last night. This was definitely a vigilante case, which was unfortunate. Did you happen to see the kid's face? No, sorry. He was wearing a black medical mask and a green hoodie. It looked very, last minute. Like he hadn't put much thought into what he was wearing. But he had a lot of weapons, knives, I think maybe swords on his back, and a big long stick. Did you catch a name? She shook her head, looking very apologetic. The other man just called him Kid. His voice sounded like he was around, well, I'm not sure how old, but in his teens. Younger teens? It was kind of high-pitched, but capable. She frowned deeply. I'm sorry, I feel so unhelpful. This is very helpful, actually. Thank you. Now, could you describe the other one? The man, she said, looking a little more excited. I didn't recognize him last night, but this morning I was watching the news and I saw him. Stain, the hero killer. Tsukachi's blood ran cold. This was very bad. One stain was enough, but Stain with an apprentice, most likely a hero school dropout, was worse. Okay, he said, trying to keep it together. Stain. And last thing. Did you happen to see the kid's quirk? She shook her head, looking sad. Sorry, I didn't see it. He didn't really seem to be using one, but I don't know. Okay, thank you. Do you need a Nisser home? No, thank you, I'll manage. She stood up with a smile. I'm glad I could help. Please call me if you have any more questions. Of course. He showed her out the door and then closed it. With a weary sigh, he pressed his forehead into the wall next to the door. A vigilante training under Stain. From the sounds of it, a very talented, very young vigilante training under Stain. They'd have to catch him soon, or he'd grow very quickly into a tremendous problem, like Stain had. Sighing again, he reopened the door and waved in the next person to get saved last night. Stain was changing his MO to paralyzing heroes and destroying their public image instead of just killing them. Toshinori was refusing to slow down his hero work and suffering because of it. Several gangs were beginning to rub up against each other in the worst way possible. And now Stain was taking on a student. Could this year possibly get any worse? Something was happening in the underworld and Tamura didn't like it. He didn't mind that something was happening, that was normal good even. The more power upheavals that took place now, the easier it would be for him and Sensei to make use of the instability. No, having things going on was good. But he didn't know what was going on, and that was annoying. To be fair, no one else knew what was going on either. Jiren didn't even know what was happening, even after he'd met with the one person in the underworld who usually had all the gossip. But it would appear that that person was the gossip in this case, because apparently he'd shown up with a kid who completely threw all of Jiren's attempts at information gathering into the trash and instead managed to draw information out of Jiren, which was not how that was supposed to work. Jiren was the Tamura's information broker for a reason, because he didn't talk about things he wasn't supposed to. He was good at it, at keeping his mouth shut, but something about this goddamn kid made him open that mouth and spill. Tamura had been so angry about it he almost murdered Jiren on the spot. Only Kurojire's soothing words had held him off. So this kid, this little, green, kid was messing things up. And Tamura wouldn't care normally, but this kid had dipped his fingers into the wrong people's business now. Tamura was going to get to the bottom of this, and then he'd decide whether or not the kid would be useful to him and Sensei. If he was useful, he'd be recruited. If he wasn't useful, Tamura would make sure he regretted messing with his broker. By the time Izuku was back in school on Monday, he'd been recommended for the UA Hero course. He hadn't really expected Reiki to act so quickly, but she sent out the necessary emails and letters in no time at all. Nizu apparently moved equally quickly, because on Monday morning, the entirety of Aldra faculty had been informed that one of their students had been submitted for recommendations. Not only that, but the student recommended was, not in fact, Bakogu Katsuki, but was instead one Midoriya Izuku. Most of the faculty were either in denial or were currently worshipping Izuku, and he didn't know which was better. He didn't really like either of them, to be honest. He'd much prefer being ignored by the teachers than this. The teachers in worship mode were just fake and slimy, and Izuku didn't want them near him because, seriously? Only now that UA thought he had potential, he was worth something? The teachers in denial weren't any better. One of you got recommended for the UA Hero course last week. One such teacher started class with, glaring around the room, and it sure as hell wasn't the quirkless. Was it you, Katsuki-kun? Why are you hiding behind Deku? Kaken scowled around the room, looking for whoever had dared surpass him and got in from recommendations. I'm not gonna get in from recommendations, I'm gonna prove how good I am in the right way, he growled, finally meeting eyes with Izuku, who wasn't sure how to handle this situation. And Deku definitely didn't get a recommendation. Izuku resisted an eye roll, but it took a great deal of self-control. So which of you Biestos was it? Kaken asked, returning to glaring at each student in turn. Which of you decided to get someone to recommend you for UA? With an annoyed huff, Izuku raised his hand. Excuse me, I did get recommended for UA's hero course. Kaken whipped around in his chair, eyes blazing. But Izuku had fought real villains now. He'd gone toe-to-toe with some of the most dangerous people in the underworld, and Kaken didn't scare him anymore. Izuku didn't care about what he had to say now. I got recommended by Fujimoto Raiki, who's a hero healer I met the other night. Don't lie to me, his teacher hissed, eyes narrowing. You fooled the UA staff into thinking you got recommended, cheating to get up in the world, just like always. Izuku was starting to get a little angry at this point. Everyone at this school was so stupid, underestimating people who didn't have flashy quirks. People without flashy quirks were going to be these people's downfall someday, because they let their own stereotyping get in the way of their heads. You seriously think a middle schooler could trick Nizu? I'm just a useless Deku, right? He snapped. How on earth would I do that? Then you tricked this Fujimoto person into recommending you, his teacher snapped back. Don't call her that, Izuku said, voice going dangerously low. He didn't use this tone often, and if his teachers paid any attention to him, they would have known that this was the tone that made bullies back off and run. This was the tone that meant murder. It was making more and more appearances lately. Don't call her by her name? Izuku's teacher said, in an almost teasing voice. Izuku stood up, slamming the palms of his hands into the top of his desk. His teacher had the decency to actually jump a little, looking marginally terrified. Some of the other students in his class were actually starting to edge out of their seats away from him. Don't pretend you understand everything about me, he snarled. You know nothing about Raiki, and you're stupid if you think she'd be so gullible as to be fooled into recommending someone to the UA hero course. Raiki recommended me because she saw something in me that no one else ever takes the effort to, and she had the compassion and the bravery to act on it. So don't act like you understand her. And don't call her Fujimoto. You couldn't possibly have gotten recommended to UA, his teacher insisted. How would you know that? Izuku retorted immediately. How would you know what talents I might have, if you've never taken the time to look? Raiki looked for potential, and she found some. Is that so hard to believe? Maybe if you spent less time with your head up your butt, you'd actually see that I'm not as incapable as everyone seems to think I am. Maybe that was too far. Even Kaken looked surprised, so that might have been pushing it. He slid out from his desk and fell into a deep bow. I apologize for my outburst, he said, forcing his tone to lighten up a little. Several students relaxed. It was out of line and completely uncalled for. I was the student recommended for UA, and I'm going to do my best to get in. He allowed the threat to show in his tone as he finished. I would suggest you support me, before you find yourself left behind. Izuku felt a little like he was the latest exhibit in the zoo. At school, the feeling was inevitable. Everywhere he went, he was followed by whispers. Most of them were not nice whispers. They were, in fact, quite cruel. People turned to each other in the halls and made bets on how long he'd manage to stay alive. They told him he was cheating, or said they didn't believe he'd been recommended at all. Some people were nice enough, he supposed, and would congratulate him or wish him luck, but even they had a tone that expressed pity, not real encouragement. The teachers gave him sorrowful looks when he passed them, as though they were looking at someone on his deathbed. Some particularly brave bullies were putting spider lilies on his desk. He figured it was only a matter of time before they began telling him to kill himself now to avoid a humiliating death later. That was fine. He'd dealt with them saying stuff like that before, he could bear it again. Anyway, he only needed to hold on for a little while longer, and then he'd be free from this school. No one, not a single person in the entire school, seemed to think he could actually be a hero. All of them were just waiting for the illusion to finally break, when he would finally see that he couldn't do it. But he refused to see it. He didn't want to see it, not when he could focus on hope instead. His hope to become someone who saved everyone. That was his focus, no matter what anyone else had to say about it. He couldn't pretend it didn't hurt, though. The way whispers followed him wherever he went at school. The way people looked at him like he was fragile enough to break at any second. How people seemed to expect him to be unable to carry himself one more step, just because he didn't have their kind of power. But to be honest, he'd always felt alienated from everyone else. He didn't see how this was any different. Anyway, half the time he believed them. Maybe he wasn't cut out to be a hero. But then, all that was different when he was out on the streets with Stain. People seemed to think he was capable of anything as soon as he put on his green hoodie and grabbed his knives. Whispers followed him there too, but they were a different kind of whisper. People spoke about him with a tone of admiration, of fear, of expectation. Everyone anticipated great things from him as a vigilante. And he'd only been on the streets for about 2 months. He hadn't even tried going solo yet, and people still were talking about him. It was flattering in a terrifying way. When he walked up to villains who were in the know, they would sometimes back down. Not always, not even often, but that was too much to hope for anyway. Most of the time people treated him like he was an interesting new challenge, at least until he kicked their butts, and then they tended to start respecting him. But sometimes he would meet people who took one look and then backed off, apologizing. Not because he was a threat now, but because no one wanted to anger someone who had so much potential, someone who had caught Stain's eye. It made him wonder why people at school never thought he was capable of growth. At night, when he slipped down the alleys in his gear, keeping half an ear out for trouble as he headed home, he would consider the difference between school and his new extracurricular. At school, people hated him because they thought he couldn't amount to anything. As a vigilante, people hated him because they were afraid of what he could turn into. He never showed any sign of a quirk on the streets. At first, he'd thought that would make people see him as less of a threat, but actually it made him into more of one. Because no one knew what his quirk was, everyone figured he was hiding it, but if he ever got into really big trouble, he could use it just as well as he could use his knives. It added an extra layer of mystery that made people wonder exactly how powerful this new kid was. But Izuku didn't have a quirk. He was planning on keeping that secret for as long as possible, because things changed when he told people. But as time went on and he got better and better as a vigilante, he began to wonder if not having a quirk to rely on meant that he had that much more room to grow than everyone else. And as he began to wonder that, he started hating the world of quirks that shut him out. Because he had just as much potential as everyone else. It just manifested itself in a different way. And everyone in this society was too blind to see that anyone, even a useless quirkless freak, could succeed. Then there was home. His mom wasn't exactly sure how to feel about him getting recommended to UA. She would alternate between bursting into tears about the possibility of her losing her baby and beaming at him with pride from across the room. And she absolutely loved Reiki. Almost every conversation Izuku had with his mother after Reiki came over was about her, what she did for a living, hero healer, how Izuku had met her at a friend's house, why she hadn't come over again, she had a busy schedule, why she was recommending him for the exam he'd asked her to. He was finding it increasingly difficult to think of convincing enough half-truths to answer the harder questions. And meanwhile, Stain had realized that Izuku's exams were coming up, and therefore was pushing him even harder than before. At first, he had been extremely helpful, throwing out tips and occasionally stepping in to aid Izuku during fights. Now, he stood on the sidelines and watched as Izuku struggled, and then later lectured him on everything he could have done better. Izuku would be the first to admit it worked, but it was still difficult, and he was quickly losing much-needed sleep with the pressure of studying for the written exam added on. Reiki was a godsend during all of this. While she didn't come over often, something about not wanting to make Izuku's mom an accomplice, she was almost always around the bars after training, and Izuku would slip in and go immediately to her, holding out his scratches and battered muscles and begging her to stitch them together. She would grab the bartender or the nearest customer and use her purple light to heal Izuku's body before sending him off with wishes of good luck and occasionally tips on how to help his body get better faster. Because she healed his muscles immediately after he ripped them apart, he never had to deal with being sore, and he made rapid progress in his strength. As it stood now, 2.5 months before the recommendation exam, he could beat Stain in hand-to-hand combat. It wasn't easy, but he could do it. Stain had also decided to make Izuku clean Dagobah Beach, which Izuku couldn't for the life of him understand, but he wanted to be better, stronger, and if the best way for him to do that was clean a disgusting beach, then Izuku was going to clean that goddamn beach. He'd already decided there was no way he was going to finish cleaning the beach on time, especially if he was still setting aside time for studying, but the little progress he could make was good enough. Tonight, though, he was out on their patrol route earlier than usual. He'd wanted to try a solo mission and Stain didn't do anything earlier than 10, so he figured if he went out at 9, he'd have some time to practice by himself before finding the hero killer. And he did. Because right away, barely 10 minutes after he'd left his house, he found some jerkwads holding up a convenience store. With an annoyed huff, he pulled out one of his katanas. Surely a sword would be enough to scare off a couple of dumbass who thought the best time to rob a store was 9-10 p.m. Did they have a bedtime or something? He kicked open the door to the store and scowled at them. "You people are the biggest idiots," he said decisively. They all glanced over and froze when they caught sight of him, the person behind the counter. Looking notably confused. "Out," Izuku said to the robbers, gesturing at the door. They shared a look between themselves and Izuku gripped his katana tighter. It was looking like he was going to have to use violence this time. But then one of them made a wild shake of her head at her friends, and the group nodded, backing away from the counter and putting their weapons down. Izuku really loved having a reputation. "Great, now you're all just going to leave here and get a job, okay?" "Can't," one of the group muttered, glaring at the floor. "And why not?" he asked, turning around to glare at them, annoyed. "We're all mutant types," the girl explained. Izuku really hated discrimination. "Oh yeah," he said, nodding sympathetically. "That makes it difficult. There's this website I found, though I'll write the address down for you. It lists a bunch of jobs for people who have weaker or mutant quirks." He stepped forward, setting his katana on the counter as he grabbed a sheet of paper and scribbled down the website address. Turning around, he held out the paper. "The jobs are all low-paying, but they're a great starting point for people who don't have much experience or haven't been able to find a job because of quirk discrimination." The one who had shaken her head earlier took the paper from him hesitantly, eyes flicking from the paper to his face a few times. "Thanks." "No problem." He started shooing them out the door. "Now go away. Stop holding up convenience stores. Get a life." They started shuffling out one at a time, muttering apologies and thank yous as they left. He just rolled his eyes and gestured them out. When they were all safely out of the building, he turned back to the shopkeeper and clapped his hands together, pleased. "Now, are you?" A huge explosion came from outside, shattering the glass windows and sending shards flying into the shop. Izuku managed to roll away from the majority of it, but he knew for a fact he had several pieces of glass stuck in his backside. Springing to his feet, he grabbed his katana and looked around for the source of danger. Instead of the low-level criminal he'd been expecting, though, he came face to face with the cold blue eyes of Endeavor. Those eyes, where had he seen those before? As Izuku looked into the hate-filled eyes of Endeavor, he knew. He was so if it. He stumbled backwards, tucking his katana away, because it wasn't like a sword was going to be useful against a literal fireball. Praying silently that Endeavor would show restraint just this one time and try to not leave collateral damage, he darted down one of the aisles, keeping his head down and footsteps light as he tried to give himself some distance and cover. Endeavor apparently hadn't had a change of heart on his views on collateral damage, and a moment later, the front half of the store was in flames. Cursing silently, Izuku pulled up the front of his hoodie over his nose and mouth and started to work his way around the back of the store, trying to get back to the shopkeeper, who was probably suffering from second-degree burns at this point. "Come out, little boy," Endeavor snarled from the front. Izuku resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Endeavor was so dramatic, honestly. What, did he think Izuku was going to hear him say that and then think, "Oh, he's right, I should make sure the rage-filled homicidal hero knows exactly where I am"? Because there was no way in hell Izuku was doing that. He was now in a position where he was out of Endeavor's line of sight, but could see the shopkeeper again, who was cowering under the counter looking like he regretted his decision to call the police. A large, completely open space lay between Izuku and the shopkeeper. As Izuku began a long internal debate on whether or not he should expose himself for the sake of some random civilian, Endeavor shot another flame ball into the shop, making up Izuku's mind for him. He sprinted forward, diving under the counter and hoping beyond all hopes that Endeavor hadn't seen him. Luck was in his favor this time. He crawled over to the shopkeeper, pulling out a roll of gauze from one of his many pockets. The shopkeeper whimpered slightly as Izuku took his arm and drew it out, examining the long, angry burn that was visible there. "Minor second degree," he muttered, seizing a bottle of water from the fridge under the counter. "Seriously, Endeavor? Dickhead." He started carefully drizzling the cool water over the shopkeeper's arm, chewing on his lower lip in concentration. "Where are you hiding?" Endeavor shouted from all the way across the store. Izuku actually did roll his eyes that time. "Idiot," he muttered. The shopkeeper nodded in agreement and then froze as though he hadn't realized what he was doing. "Pull your shirt over your nose and mouth," Izuku instructed, pretending he hadn't noticed. "You need protection from the smoke. Keep drizzling water on that, okay? I'm going to find a way out." Very carefully, he poked his head up over the counter, looking for Endeavor's fiery head. He found it a moment later, in the back corner. Endeavor was setting things on fire right and left as he tried to flush Izuku out. He sighed. The property damages on this poor store were going to be so much more expensive than anything the store would have lost originally. Good thing Endeavor had deep pockets. The storekeeper tugged on his sleeve, and he glanced over. "There's a back entrance," the shopkeeper wheezed. "Endeavor's in the back corner," Izuku said distractedly, going back to watching Endeavor's fiery crown. "It's behind the counter." Izuku's head whipped around again. He honestly could have kissed the shopkeeper right now. "Lead the way." The man nodded and crawled out from under the counter, pulling open a small door in the wall, just big enough for a decently sized person to crawl through. He ducked through it, Izuku close behind, and they gently shut the door behind them. "Why is that there?" Izuku asked curiously, letting the front of his hoodie fall. They were in a short tunnel now, with standing room. Izuku thought he could see another door up ahead, presumably to the outside. "Almost every store nowadays has one of those," the shopkeeper explained. "Villains come in a lot, so it's nice to have a way to get out, especially when the heroes show up." "Why?" Izuku had been about to ask why it was important when the heroes showed up, but then he remembered what the interior of the store looked like right now. It was an absolute mess, and it had been fine safe even before Endeavor showed up. "Oh." Pushing the door open to the outside, the storekeeper nodded. "Sometimes people say they wish heroes wouldn't come, because the heroes themselves are more damaging than the villains." "Not all the time," Izuku argued. A moment later, he wondered why he'd said it. Why was he defending heroes? Not all heroes were bad, sure, but who cared about the few that were good when there were still some who were dangerous and untrustworthy? People needed to hold them responsible. "True," the shopkeeper conceded, letting Izuku follow him out and shutting the door behind him. "Okay, can you call the EMT?" Izuku asked, back to formalities now that the immediate danger had passed. "I'm sure they're all ready." "Call anyway," Izuku said, reaching for the shopkeeper's arm again. He expertly twisted the gauze around it, keeping it tight, but loose enough that it wouldn't rub at the skin or cut off circulation. "You're going to want them to look at that. I would recommend using aloe after they treat it, it'll calm down." A huge explosion came from behind them, followed by an animalistic roar from Endeavor, and Izuku flinched. "I think I should." The shopkeeper nodded. "You should go." Izuku turned to leave, and then remembered the dumbass he'd just sent out of the store. The explosion had come seconds after they left. Were they okay? Heart beating fast, Izuku ran for the front of the store, hugging the external brick wall as he went, in order to reduce visibility. As he came around the corner, he saw them. Two were moving, definitely injured, but alive, and they were crowding around the other one, whose body was still. Sheet. Abandoning all stealth, Izuku sprinted across the sidewalk, nudging the two aside as he knelt by the still one. It was the girl, the one who had recognized him and called it off. "Sheet, sheet, sheet." He reached for the side of her neck, maybe the only visible part of her that wasn't covered in deep, deep burns. There wasn't a pulse. Feeling nauseous, Izuku fished out his phone from its very secret hiding place in one of his pockets. His fingers fumbled for her number, but finally he got it. Reiki picked up on the first ring. "Sup, Deku? You stabbed Stain again?" "No, I'm sitting in front of a dead girl and I don't know what to do. I'm with two heavily injured criminals outside a shop that Endeavor's in." "I'm calling Dabi," she interrupted, voice suddenly sharp. "Text me your location." "Okay." She hung up and he texted her the address of the store, before turning back to the dead woman in front of him. Without another moment's hesitation, he started CPR. He would have started sooner, but he knew he needed backup. "Count for me," he said to the closest dumbass. He didn't have the brain capacity for multitasking right now, not when his mind was frayed out in all directions, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. The guy started counting for him, voice shaking. "Other dumbass, I'm going to give you some instructions and I need you to follow them to the letter. Do you understand?" "Yes." "You're going to take your friend here and you're going to go half a mile west. You are going to find an alley and you're going to wait there until I come to you. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Go." Izuku took over counting and the two of them left, one of them limping and the other one looking extremely dizzy. He didn't have time to watch them, as he sucked to rescue breaths a moment later. He could still save her, she could still be saved. Just a few more compressions, a couple more breaths, a few more compressions, a couple more breaths, a few more. Dabi was here. Izuku knew immediately, because he came with a wave of blue flame and a lot of angry, incoherent yelling. "Deku, you idiot," he shouted, finally comprehensible. "Not an idiot," Izuku breathed. "This girl is super dead." "Why are you doing chest compressions then?" Dabi asked, looking extremely angry. "I have to try to save her." "You have to get out of here." "Come on, Reiki's on her way. I've got damage control." "You'll be blamed for the fire damage," Izuku argued. "And this girl's death. It'll be the first thing on your criminal record." Dabi had, miraculously, managed to keep his criminal record clean until this moment of time. It was something he bragged about constantly. Ironically, Endeavor had managed to keep his criminal record clean too. Izuku had to wonder how many cover-ups that man had paid for. "And you'll still be alive." Izuku paused in the argument to do 2 more rescue breaths, and when he resurfaced, Dabi had already launched himself into the inferno that was the small store. The last thing Izuku saw of Dabi before the man disappeared was his cold blue eyes. "Hold on. Those eyes. Oh shit." Izuku was on his feet in an instant, abandoning his fruitless attempts at CPR. Dabi had just launched himself into a fight with Endeavor. What was he thinking? He was going to get caught. He started to run for the building, mind scrambling for a way to win, a way to beat the second most powerful hero in all Japan. He was almost at the door when a fist caught his throat and he stumbled back, choking. "What are you doing?" Reiki hissed, getting up in his face. "Get the hell out of here." "The girl," he gasped, waving back at her, "is extremely dead and has been for several minutes. Dabi knows what he's doing, let's go." Reiki grabbed his arm and dragged him off. She was surprisingly strong, and Izuku was tired and his body ached and he had glass stuck in his butt and his eyes were burning. He weakly attempted to get away, but she was not having it. "Where are the other two?" she demanded. "West," Izuku said. "We're going to find them and we're going to save them." Being a hero, Deku, is all about priorities. Sometimes you can't save everyone, and you have to choose. And when we choose the people we know we can help. We choose what we can do with our own skills. Humans are inherently selfish, Midoriya. In moments where we have to prioritize, we choose ourselves. Izuku blinked, swaying on his feet. He'd only caught half of that. "What?" Reiki shook her head with a heavy sigh. "You're hopeless." "Say it again, in a language I can understand," Izuku said. "We are going to go help the people I know we can help," Reiki said very slowly, punctuating every word. "We can't help a dead girl and we can't fight Endeavor, but we can help some heavily burned dumbass, so we're going to." "Why didn't you just say that?" Reiki gave him a lofty look. "The beauty of philosophy. Oh, shut up. Later that night, after Izuku had helped Raiki heal two dumbasses and talk them through their grief, after Izuku had endured a long lecture from Stain, after Izuku had gone home and snuck in through his window, after he had watched the news carefully for Dabi and found he'd managed to escape after all that, Izuku sat at his computer, flexing and clenching his fingers methodically over the keyboard. He'd refrained from doing this for so long that now that he had made up his mind to research Dabi, it felt like he was about to commit the biggest sin in history. Maybe it was just because Dabi was his friend now, and he didn't want to violate the man's privacy. But no matter what was holding him back, he knew he needed to do this. He needed to understand. With a heavy release of breath, he began to type. Endeavor 4th Kid? 1,248 results and a picture of a white-haired boy with Dabi's eyes, proclaimed dead at 15. OF dash. The incident with Endeavor was all Izuku could think about. It had happened months ago, and it was still echoing around in his head, screaming at him for attention. What kind of hero did any of that? The incident with the store was enough to rattle Izuku's perceptions of all heroes, but adding Dabi on top of that. Dropping into his seat, Izuku started organizing the facts in his brain for the 100th time. Endeavor attacked a store where there was no clear sign of hostile action except for maybe Izuku's katana, completely burned the place down and gave the storekeeper several, admittedly minor, burns. In the process of doing so, he killed a girl who was leaving the scene without actually committing a crime, and severely injured two other people. The store was ruined, thousands of dollars in collateral damage, several people's lives were put in danger, and one of them was killed. What kind of a hero treated criminals like that? What kind of a hero treated innocent bystanders like that? What kind of hero did all that and got away with it? Izuku had to wonder if Katsuki would turn out like that too. All blame for the fire, damages, and death were put on Dabi, who now had a criminal record. He was trying to keep on the down low for now, staying out of the public eye for a while until he could start sneaking around again. Meanwhile, Endeavor paid for the damages to the store, most likely in an attempt to keep the shopkeeper quiet and get a reputation boost at the same time. People loved Endeavor. The headlines said stuff like, "Fighting fire with fire, why Endeavor couldn't save them," or "Endeavor pays damages for local business caught in a villain attack." It set Izuku off. The headlines should have said, "Reckless use of quirk from Endeavor," or "Endeavor kills a girl," or "Why Endeavor shouldn't be a hero." Instead, people were celebrating him. It made Izuku feel sick. And then Dabi and everyone else in that poor family. Izuku promised himself that if he ever met the youngest kid, who supposedly had the perfect quirk, he'd personally kidnap him, just to get him out of that house. His mom wouldn't mind when he explained why. Hero society wasn't what Izuku had imagined. He wasn't sure whether or not he really wanted to be a part of it anymore. Which SCKD, because this afternoon, he was going to take the recommendation exam. He suffered through homeroom and his morning classes, and then finally he was called to the front office to go to his showcase. Raiki picked him up, grinning broadly. As his sponsor, she was required to accompany him to the exam. "Ready, fucker?" she asked as he signed himself out of the front office. Ignoring the shocked looks from the front office staff at her language, Izuku nodded. "Ready." They left together. UA was big. Shudo found that he didn't really care. It was just another place where he'd go through relentless training. The where didn't matter. Neither did the why, particularly because he knew why. It was because he had a perfect quirk for heroics, and it was his job to use it so his father could live vicariously through Shudo's success. The how did matter, though. He was tired of being burned when he refused to use his fire. Hopefully UA would be more welcoming to the idea that Shudo didn't want to use his left side in combat. He walked up the front steps to the building, a few paces behind his father so he didn't get in the way. This was his job when they were in public become invisible. The public would be allowed to notice him when it was time, but for now, always behind and to the right, head down. Don't make people want to look at you for too long, always point their attention back to Endeavor. After all, Endeavor was the hero right now and he needed a popularity boost. The hallways of UA were long and tall. Shudo liked how much space there was. It didn't feel claustrophobic. It made him feel much safer than the dark, low ceilings of his own home, where Endeavor could appear at any time, huge body taking up all available space. They made their way toward the amphitheater where the written tests would be taken, Endeavor giving a long lecture about decorum and what Shudo should and shouldn't do. Shudo tuned him out, face completely impassive. He didn't need or want to listen to another lecture right now. The door to the testing room was just as huge as every other door in the school, and when it opened as they walked up, Shudo blinked in surprise at the difference in size between Nizu and the door. "You're early," Nizu chirped with a smile as he showed Endeavor and Shudo inside. "Punctuality is an important trait in a hero," Endeavor said coldly, casting a sidelong look at Shudo, as though expecting him to be taking notes. "You never used to think that," Nizu said thoughtfully. "People change." Nizu's sharp eyes glinted as he looked at Endeavor. "Don't they?" he said, clearly searching Endeavor's face for something. He didn't seem to have quite found what he was looking for, when he suddenly turned to the door and swung it open, smiling at the two people outside, a boy with vivid, curly green hair and a woman not much older, with a long purple ponytail and clear gray eyes. Most striking about them both, though, was the way they held themselves. There was a visible weight on their shoulders, and although they were smiling as though someone had just interrupted a joke, it didn't reach their sad, thoughtful eyes. And the moment the door opened, both of them looked straight at Endeavor and scowled. The purple one put her hands on her hips. "What's he?" She was cut off as the boy, now frowning at Shudo, elbowed her expertly in the ribs. "Hi, I'm Midoriya Izuku," he said. The sentence was clearly directed at Nizu, but his eyes didn't move from Shudo. "The quirkless one," Nizu said warmly. "Quirkless?" Midoriya's back tensed and he ripped his eyes off Shudo's to meet Nizu's instead. Shudo felt his body relax, now that the pressure of those green eyes was off him. "Problem?" Midoriya snapped. It was the purple one's turn to elbow him in the ribs. He blinked and the angriness slipped away, replaced by an open, friendly expression. Shudo was no longer sure which expression showed his real feelings, although the look in his green eyes seemed to suggest the former. Nizu was beaming almost maniacally, looking at Midoriya like he was an interesting problem to solve or project to finish. "Quirkless." Endeavor spat. Shudo glanced over to see his father glaring at Midoriya with venom. "And more of a hero than you," Midoriya responded in a sweet voice, smiling innocently. The purple girl hid a smirk behind her hand. The tension in the room was so high at this point, Shudo was almost afraid the room was going to explode. Instead, smiling contentedly, Nizu trotted to the door and opened it to let in another student and sponsor. The tension scattered as the two walked in and Shudo felt himself relaxing again. Midoriya Izuku and his purple friend had a quick, hushed conversation and then retreated to the corner of the room. "He seems awful," Raiki was saying, glaring at Endeavor's son. "No, he doesn't," Izuku disagreed. "He's abused." "K. What?" "Exactly." "What?" Raiki sighed. "What do you mean he's abused?" Izuku gestured vaguely at his face. "Abused." As she looked back over at the boy, Raiki's eyes lit up in understanding. "Oh. Yeah." She laughed, leaning back against the wall as another prospective student came in. "It's incredible, Deku. How you look at the most prickly of people and see someone who needs saving." She grinned. "Do you think Endeavor needs saving?" "Saving from himself, maybe," Izuku muttered, shooting a dark look at him. "I'd guess he's constantly going on spirals of self-loathing. He puts too much pressure on himself for absolutely no reason. You know what he needs? Therapy. Don't we all?" Nizu trotted over, eyes glinting with interest. "So, you're quirkless, yes?" "Yes. And a vigilante at such a young age, interesting." Izuku felt his heart speed up, but he managed to cover his panic by raising an eyebrow nonchalantly. Raiki was doing an excellent job of tilting her head to the side in confusion. People are calling you entropy." "I've never heard of that," Izuku said. That was, at least, honest. He'd never heard anyone call him entropy before. He had to wonder where that nickname came from. Probably Stain or Dabi. The two of them were crazy. "How did you two meet?" "Through a friend," Raiki said with a rehearsed smile. "A friend at a bar?" Izuku looked at Reiki and Reiki looked at him back, and they simultaneously came to the same conclusion. Nizu was too smart for them. All they could do now is refrain from saying anything incriminating that could be used against them. "I'm underage," Izuku said, tipping his head to the side and narrowing his focus on the conversation. "One slip-up and this would fall apart." "I'm surprised you care about not breaking the law," Nizu said, "with everything you've done." Izuku was actually quite proud of how little he did illegal things. Only occasionally, when he needed to hack into something or had to go to the bar. But technically he could do whatever he wanted as a vigilante as long as he didn't use excessive violence or use his quirk, so the laws he did break were usually minor, maybe enough to get him a couple months in jail. But Nizu wasn't allowed to know about that. "I'm surprised you think a prospective hero would be fine with breaking the rules. So you think heroes shouldn't ever break laws? Does that extend to Fujimoto-san?" Reiki stiffened a little. "Doctor-patient confidentiality," Izuku said smoothly. "She's legally required to help whoever she can." Nizu laughed, corners of his eyes crinkling up. "I like you, Midoriya-kun. I hope you pass." Letting himself relax a little, Izuku nodded. "Me too." Reiki nudged him in the shoulder. "Obviously." The Todorokis kept glaring at a green boy in the corner, so Inesa decided to go over and try to make friends, because any enemy of Endeavor was a friend of his. He bounded up, beaming and bowed. "What's up? I'm Yurashi Inesa." The boy smiled toothily, causing the woman next to him to start cracking up laughing for some reason. Inesa didn't mind. Both of them seemed very passionate. "Hi. I'm Midoriya Izuku. It's so nice to meet you. Are you excited for the exam?" "I'm not nervous at all. It's going to go great, I'm sure of it." The boy nodded, still smiling widely. There was something off about his smile, but Inesa couldn't place what it was, so he just put it down as sheer nervousness. He rattled off, pronouns, favorite color, quirk. "Go." Midoriya nodded, responding, "He's series, red? And I'm actually quirkless." Inesa froze. "Wait, what?" "I'm quirkless," he repeated, smile becoming a little fixed. "Oh man, I'm so sorry." "It's not a bad thing," the woman next to him snapped, glaring. "Okay." Inesa thought it was a very bad thing, but maybe this woman just didn't understand what being quirkless meant. It meant being weaker than everyone else, being the person heroes saved, instead of... "But then what are you doing here?" Inesa asked him, confused. "Taking the recommendation exam." Inesa's eyes widened. That was a terrible idea. But man, you're going to die. And even if he didn't die in the recommendation exam, there was no way he was going to get in, so why would it matter? Why take the test if he knew he was going to fail? Quirkless people couldn't be heroes. Neither of them took his statement well. Midoriya's smile completely dropped, replaced by something a lot darker. "Am I?" he asked, voice dangerously low. Nizu interrupted before Inesa could answer, clapping his paws together and standing on his desk. "We're going to get started now," Nizu announced, sharp eyes drifting over to Midoriya and Inesa. They lingered on Midoriya before moving on. The exam is split into 3 parts: a written exam, a practical exam, and an interview. We'll get started with the written exam now, so please find a seat. While you are all taking the written portion, I'll be interviewing your sponsors. Present Mike will be officiating the practical portion, so when you finish the written exam, please find him in the hallway and wait for the others to be finished. Thank you for your time, we look forward to your applications. I myself am quite excited for this new group of... Present Mike burst into the room just in time, as Nizu seemed to be about to go on a long ramble. "Who's ready to take the written exam?" Present Mike screeched. Inesa cheered. No one else did, but that was fine. Present Mike had enough enthusiasm and passion for all of them. Present Mike pointed at him as Nizu climbed down from the desk and started leaving the room. "I like you." "Sponsors, follow me," Nizu said, standing at the door. Inesa's sponsor gave him a good luck pat on the shoulder and left the room. Midoriya's sponsor gave him a long, serious look, to which he returned a sharp nod, before she left. When all of the sponsors were out, Nizu said, "Good luck," and closed the door with an evil smile. Inesa grinned, putting the quirkless kid out of his mind. He was ready. As much as Reiki loved Deku, she didn't know how she was going to talk him up to Nizu, the smartest being on the planet. Nizu had a sharp mind, and Reiki wasn't nearly as good at lying as Deku was. Unfortunately, Nizu seemed to be extremely interested in Deku, so he asked her to come in first. People sent her dirty looks as she passed them. Most of them probably didn't recognize her. Her hero costume was a complicated mask, and no one ever recognized her when she wasn't wearing it. No one recognized her when she was being herself. Except for villains and Deku, that is. And even if they did recognize her, now that everyone was aware of Midoriya's quirk status, they were hostile to her for sponsoring a weakling. If they were thinking that, though, they were dead wrong, and Deku was about to prove it in the practical. Reiki couldn't wait to watch the practical. She stepped into Nizu's office, letting the door slide shut behind her. Tea? Nizu asked, climbing up into his chair and sliding a full teacup across the desk toward Reiki. Thank you. Let's discuss Midoriya Izu, shall we? She nodded, mouth going dry. This was even more stressful than she'd imagined it was going to be. Why do you think he'd be a good fit for you? What makes him a hero? Nizu asked. Reiki's shoulders slumped down in relief. She could answer that. Deku has the kindest heart I've ever seen, she said honestly. He extends it to everyone he comes across. He has a lot of criticism on hero society, but he treats it as an issue that needs to be solved, rather than submitting to it or using it as an excuse to be violent. He's observant and he genuinely cares about everyone, in a way I don't even see many heroes caring. And you see this when he's a vigilante? The corner of Reiki's lip twitched up and she forced it down. Nizu really was tricky. I see it any time I'm around him. Do you think he can keep up with the curriculum? Reiki almost laughed. He's one of the smartest people I know and he's a teenager. Of course he can. He'll probably stay ahead even. Now, I know you probably want to avoid discussing this, but unfortunately we need to talk about his quirklessness. Reiki let a scowl cross her face. So much unintentional discrimination in this world. Who cared about his quirk? He wanted to be a hero. Do you think he'll be able to handle the extreme conditions heroes face every day? Having a quirk makes no difference in handling stress, Reiki said coldly. Can he hold himself against a quirked opponent? Reiki lifted her eyes and met the rats. You're the one convinced he's a vigilante. What do you think? The written exam was easy. It was so easy, Izuku started to get concerned he was answering questions wrong, and they were secretly all trick questions. Some of them were difficult, obviously, and he knew for a fact he hadn't answered all of them correctly, but overall, the test wasn't hard at all. Izuku finished first by a lot. He took his test to present Mike and went to sit at his desk. After he sat for several minutes of intense boredom, the girl with the black ponytail got up and handed in her test. The Ida kid was next, and after that, people started filing their tests rapidly. When everyone had finished, Present Mike passed out numbers to pin to their chests and started shepherding them to the location of the practical exam. As Present Mike explained the exam, Izuku fell into deep thought. An obstacle course. An obstacle course race. Izuku didn't have a speed quirk, and knowing UA, the obstacles would be difficult. So his only option was to cheat, or to stop everyone else from moving. He didn't think Nizu would mind him cheating as long as he didn't technically break any rules. Nizu honestly would be delighted at his creative thinking. So he listened carefully as Present Mike began listing the rules, trying to figure out how to cheat the race. How could he get to the end faster than everyone else? What could he, a quirkless, weaponless kid, do to cheat on the practical? The obstacles would probably slow everyone else down, except for the few people that were too powerful and could just blow right past them. If Izuku could find a way around the obstacles, that would be best, but based on the map, the obstacles took up the entire space of the course. He chewed on his lip. Luckily, Present Mike was sending people to go in groups, so he had time to think. Keeping half an eye on the other examinees, he tried to focus on the issue at hand. Maybe the best course of action was just to take the obstacles at a pace he could deal with, showing off his skills instead of trying to get around it. He wanted to finish first, but maybe he didn't have to. Maybe he just needed to show what he could do, But what could he do, really? He was good at hand-to-hand combat and analysis and knowing what other people could do with their individual skills. He blinked. Groups. They were being put into groups. A grin spread across his face and he turned to find the billboard that said who he was being grouped with. Memorizing the names, he started searching through the small crowd of people who were taking the recommendation exam. He came across the girl with the ponytail and smiled. "Hey, are you Yaoyorozu Momo?" She blinked in surprise at being spoken to, but nodded. "Yes, that's my name." "Hi, I'm Midoriya Izuku. We're in the same group. I was wondering if you wanted to team up." "To team up?" He nodded. "Right. I was going to find everyone else too. I think we can pass the fastest out of everybody if we work together." The Ida kid came over, chopping his hands through the air violently. "That's not how the test is supposed to work," he scolded. Izuku tipped his head to the side. Ida was in his group too, which was annoying because of how uptight the guy seemed to be. "There's not a rule against it. It's called teamwork, and I actually think it's an admirable quality in a person." "I'm in your group too," a girl with dark green hair said, poking her head into the conversation. She literally poked her head in, her body was standing a few feet away. Izuku grinned. "You must be Tokage Setsuna." "That's it." "Okay, can I know your quirks please?" "All three of you." "I'm not sure this is a good idea," Yaoyorozu said, crossing her arms over her waist nervously. "It might be better if we show off our skills individually." The rest of Tokage's body came over as she frowned. "I think being able to show that you can work in a group is a really important thing for a hero. Plus, I really want to win, and I think we'll be able to do that better if we work together." Yaoyorozu considered that for just a moment before nodding. "My quirk is creation. Anything you can think of, I can create from my skin." Izuku's eyes widened in excitement. "That is such a cool quirk. The applications of that. Does it run on fat stores and lipids and stuff? How much stuff can you make before you get tired?" "How much? Maybe we should focus on making a plan?" Tokage suggested kindly, interrupting him. "Right, okay, what's your quirk?" "Lizard. I can break off pieces of my body. Up to around 30 right now, but I'm working on more." "That's so cool." He trailed off, clearing his throat before he started rambling. They didn't have time for that. "And you're an Ida, right?" he asked the Ida kid. "So, engine?" "My name is Ida Tenya." "Quirk, engine." Izuku nodded. "Right, that's what I just said." "What's your quirk?" Yaoyorozu asked him, flexing her fingers and glancing nervously at the board to check their names hadn't been called. "I'm quirkless," Izuku answered immediately, purposefully following her gaze to the board so he didn't have to see everyone's shocked expressions. "Quirkless," Tokage repeated. He dropped his gaze back down to his group. They were all staring at him with wide, scared eyes. Shrugging, he answered, "Yes. Don't underestimate me." "Midoriya-kun," Yaoyorozu whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. "I'm so sorry." "I'm not on my deathbed," he snapped, pulling away from her. "It's fine. I'm going to get us all across that finish line with or without a quirk, so shut up about it." "But quirkless people can't be heroes," Ida said, looking confused. "How are you supposed to fight villains if you don't have a quirk?" Izuku wanted to bang his head against a wall. This really wasn't that complicated. "I don't want to be dragged down by someone quirkless," Tokage said slowly, like she was thinking through the ramifications of his quirklessness on the rest of the group. "Oh, for F's sake," Izuku muttered under his breath. He pointed a finger at all three of them, hardening his expression. "Listen up. I'm getting you all across that finish line as fast as humanly possible. So ignore the fact I don't have a quirk, because it's irrelevant. Focus on this. I have a plan." The three of them shared a hesitating glance and then Tokage shook her head, backing up. "Sorry, I think I'll be faster on my own." Ida gave her a sharp nod of agreement. "I too would like to try on my own." They left, going in different directions, Tokage casting a worried look at Izuku as she walked away. Izuku sent a desperate glance at Yaoyorozu, who was studying her fingers carefully. "You really have a plan?" she asked, gaze lifting from her fingers to meet his eyes. "I mean, it's not as good now as it was a second ago, But, yeah. Yaoyorozu looked at her feet and then nodded. I don't have any ideas, she said, almost apologetically. Izuku grinned. That's okay. I do. Izuku lined up with Yaoyorozu and the rest of the group, frowning at the obstacle course through narrowed eyes. It shouldn't be too difficult with Yaoyorozu with him, especially if what she said about being able to make anything was true. That meant they could pretty much just run over the obstacles without even thinking about it. Present Mike gave them the go-ahead. Frictionless sled. What? Make a frictionless sled. I'll push you because I think I'm probably a little faster. Shaking her head in confusion, Yaoyorozu touched her forehead in concentration. While she started making the sled, Izuku explained. We're going to get on the sled and slide over the obstacles in it. If you could pour oil or something out in front of us as we go, that would make us even faster. She nodded and pulled a sled out of her shimmering stomach. Okay, I can produce oil out of my fingers as we go. Izuku did a fist pump. This is going to be fun, get on it. Laughing now, she set the sled on the ground and held onto it while she got on. Immediately, it started to try to slide away and Izuku grabbed the end of it before it could. Okay, ready? She nodded, grinning, holding a hand out over the front of the sled. Oil started dribbling out of her fingers, making a little puddle on the ground. Izuku started running with the sled, pushing on it and gathering speed as they approached the first big downhill, Yaoyorozu squirting oil out in front of them to make the sled go even faster. As it started to go faster than him, he climbed on the back, crouching down behind Yaoyorozu as the sled took off down the hill. They slid and flew right over a slew of obstacles, Izuku trying to steer the sled in a way that would keep up the pace. Start trying to make wood planks. With lightweight motors attached to them, he shouted over the rush of wind as they flew past the examinees in the back. She nodded, cutting off the oil supply while she focused on making a new thing. They were going quickly enough that they didn't need it now anyway. They were quickly approaching the big pool of water at the bottom of the hill. Grinning, Izuku braced himself for impact. The sled hit the water with a huge splash, skimming along the top of it for a good 50 feet, and leaving the other examinees in the dust, until slowing down and starting to sink. Wood plank. Yaoyorozu nodded and a moment later a few big wooden planks, fitted with elegant black motors, bobbed to the surface of the water. They held onto them, floating in the middle of the big pool. How do you turn on the motors? Izuku asked after a fruitless attempt. I'll do it. She reached over and flipped on his motors, sending him rushing forward. It wasn't the fastest, so he started kicking to help, cursing the fact that the Ida kid, who was already pulling ahead again, hadn't decided to join them. Izuku and Yaoyorozu were in third place by the time they reached the other end of the pool, Ida and Tokage in front of them. Ida was just ahead, just now hitting the rock wall they had to climb. Tokage, however, was nowhere to be found. Izuku had known she had a dangerous quirk in this game. The ability to split herself apart made her much faster and gravity-defiant. Her quirk was the reason he wanted her on his team in the first place, to slow her down. But that didn't matter now. They needed to catch up. Retractable grappling hook, about 200 feet. A moment later, one was placed in his hand. Without a second's hesitation, he pointed it up and fired at the top of the cliff. It caught and he retracted it, letting him fly up into the air. Yaoyorozu followed a moment later, and they soared past the people trying to climb the rock cliff, putting themselves in second again, just behind Tokage. Springy shoes. Izuku shouted at her as they were pulled up the cliff. And a hang glider. Her eyes lit up in surprise and excitement, and then she nodded. He helped her over the top of the cliff, smirking at how much space there was now between the two of them and Ida, who was only about halfway up the cliff. As he was looking down, he felt a nudge on his arm and turned to be handed a pair of shoes with jets on the soles. I know you said springs, but I thought jets would be better, she said. Jets are better. Will they work? I think so. I'll take it. He pulled his on, hopping on one foot and then the other, and then started sprinting for the other edge of the cliff, behind which there was a huge gorge. Yaoyorozu matched his strides. Hang glider, he shouted. She drew it out of her arm, passing one end to Izuku as they ran. We need some height. She nodded and activated their jet boots, sending them both flying into the sky for a moment. The hang glider caught their fall as the jet boots ran out of steam, and they glided over the gorge and the rest of the obstacle course. They passed Tokage, who was stuck in some mud below them. After gliding right over the last obstacles, they landed just behind the finish line. Izuku glanced at their time. They were third fastest, right behind Todoroki and Yurashi from the first group. That was awesome, Yaoyorozu said, collapsing the hang glider in one smooth motion and tucking it under her arm. He opened his mouth to agree, and to thank her for agreeing to work with him, but then she said, "But why did you lie about not having a quirk?" He froze, mouth half open, and then frowned, eyebrows furrowing. "What?" "I mean, a quirkless person wouldn't be able to do that," she said. "You were thinking so fast. I could barely keep up. You must have an intelligence quirk, or an analysis quirk, right?" Izuku shook his head. "Nope. I'm quirkless." She frowned and then shrugged. "If you say so. What's that supposed to mean?" "Midoriya Izuku, it's time for your interview," a sleepy voice said over the speaker. With a little huff of displeasure, Izuku turned away from Yaoyorozu and started toward the building. Maybe Nizu would be a little more accepting of someone different than the normal mold. After all, Nizu didn't really fit in either.